and has owned him for the better part of 30 years. And then Lever News, and I pointed this out to you, I believe, yesterday, Lever News just published an in-depth report about how Crow's companies are substantially, financially benefiting from Clarence Thomas's tie-breaking votes. The most recent, and I think one of the more egregious cases, was this case involving the Clean Water Act, where Clarence Thomas was the tie-breaking vote. Brett Kavanaugh even voted against this decision. But Clarence Thomas was the tie-breaking vote that ended federal protection of about half the wetlands in America at the same time that one of the Crow companies was trying to build a huge, apparently warehouse complex of some sort in Georgia, and was being held up because there was a wetland on there. Well, that's not going to be an issue anymore, apparently. So what do we do here? Well, there's really two options. You know, one is for there to be an investigation of corruption by the Justice Department of Clarence Thomas. That's not going to happen. And the other, you know, especially with Merrick Garland. And the other is to impeach him, and that's not going to happen. Impeachment has to originate in the House of Representatives, which is owned by the Republicans right now, and you know, no Supreme Court justice has ever been successfully removed from office. Samuel Chase in 1805 was impeached by the House, but the Senate failed to convict him. But there is a lesson in the 1970s, and that was the lesson that Richard Nixon taught us. When Nixon became president, the most liberal member of the Supreme Court was a guy named Abe Fortas. And Fortas's wife worked at a high-powered law firm in Washington, D.C., and there had been this claim back in 1968 when Lyndon Johnson wanted to make Abe Fortas the Chief Justice. Earl Warren announced in '68 that he was going to retire. And LBJ wanted to make Abe Fortas the Chief Justice, and this claim came out that Fortas's wife was somehow involved in some illegal or criminal tax scheme, and the proof of it was in the safe in her office. They actually looked into this in '68 and found that there was no merit. It was just a complete BS charge. But now Richard Nixon, you know, a couple of years later, Richard Nixon was president, and so he had John Mitchell convene a grand jury to investigate Abe Fortas's wife. At which point, now, you know, keep in mind, this was complete BS. There was no there, but still, the old saying, you know, a grand jury can indict a ham sandwich. Fortas, in order to stop John Mitchell from dragging his wife through the mud, resigned from the Supreme Court. Now, Ginny Thomas, in my opinion, has, you know, some significant issues that are worthy of investigation by a grand jury, shall we say. Number one is her involvement in the fake electors scheme. This is a clear, in my opinion, the whole fake electors scheme is a clear criminal fraud against the United States. In addition to being seditious and all those other things, just, you know, faking government forms is a crime itself. And, you know, I'm expecting to see some significant prosecutions around this coming out of Jack Smith. We'll see, you know, where it all goes. But, you know, this is an issue because Ginny Thomas sent letters, email letters, to a majority of the Republican legislators in the state of Arizona, asking them to, essentially asking them to watch a YouTube video, but the call for action to the YouTube video is apparently to participate in the fake elector scheme. She also sent, you know, similar notes to members of state legislature in Wisconsin. Then there's also her involvement with the January 6th rally. Now, you know, she left, or at least she asserts that she left before any violence began. And she asserts that she was not one of the organizers, but one of the people in the middle of the whole thing who worked for the group that had the permit for the ellipse, said that she was, that Ginny Thomas was the person who basically negotiated among the various warring factions to bring them together and make the January 6th rally happen. And that has never been seriously investigated. So I'm saying that, you know, Merrick Garland needs to convene a grand jury. Now, I get it. Merrick Garland is so timid and so afraid of doing anything that might be perceived as political that for 2 years he ignored the blatant criminality of Donald Trump. until finally the January 6th committee shamed him into appointing Jack Smith. Well, you know, this summer, it looks like Jack Smith is going to nail Donald Trump and probably a couple dozen other people. My prediction is going to be that when Jack Smith finally issues indictments, it's not just going to be Donald Trump. It's going to be 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 people. It's going to be a bunch of people that he's going to be going after. I mean, we'll see. I may be wrong, but that's how Robert Mueller did it. You'll recall, Robert Mueller indicted some 30 some odd people, 37 people, as I recall. In the majority of them, I think 27 of them were in Russia. But he actually got convictions. I mean, out of the Mueller investigation came the conviction of Trump's first campaign manager, Paul Manafort. So anyhow, bottom line is, I think that this would be a way to, number one, show not just Clarence Thomas, but the other members of the court who are living high on the hog right now. Justice Roberts, his wife making $10 million bucks, you know, hustling lawyers into law firms to argue before the court, and who paid off Brett Kavanaugh's, you know, gambling debts and stuff like that. What's going on with Sam Alito and his luxury trips to Europe. There's just a bunch of questions here that are worthy of investigation, but start with Ginny Thomas, in my opinion. So number one, it tells them, you know, corruption is something that will not stand. Number two, it has you know, could shed some light on the ability to shed some light on actually what happened behind the scenes in the organizing for January 6th, if it turns out that Ginny Thomas wasn't directly involved with that.
We say fight back!
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
Well, it's the last day of the pledge drive. This is it. This is it. There is no more. This is it. Your last chance to get that special blessing, that special warm glow, that special great feeling that you get from being part of something larger than yourself, of being part of a movement, part of Free Speech TV. And there's a special treat with regard to that, too, today, and that is that a group of frontline funders have put together a match so that whatever you contribute today will be doubled up to $20,000. That's a big deal. Up to $20,000. Your $1,000 gift becomes a $2,000 gift. Your $10,000 gift becomes a $20,000 gift. Your $10 gift becomes a $20 gift. Whatever it is, it's going to be doubled. The Frontline Funders put this together in support of all of the favorite daily programs, the Stephanie Miller Show, my program, Randy Rhodes, Democracy Now!, David Pakman, and now Indian Country Today. And a special thank you, by the way, to all the summer Frontline Funders. Thanks to Andrew in San Diego, California, Anonymous in Walla Walla, Washington, Bill in Boise, Idaho, Bruno in Northport, New York, Vivian and Bobby in La Puente, California,
Brenda in Texas, Charlene in Houston, Texas, Delaney in Bacyrus, Missouri, B-A-C-Y-R-U-S. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing. Karen in Lingsborg, Kansas, Mac and Tiana in Cowdrey, Colorado, James in Asheville, North Carolina, Janet in Downers Grove, Illinois, Joe in Washington, D.C., Joyce in Apache Junction, Arizona, Mike in Tippecanoe County, Indiana, Suzanne in Catlett, Virginia, and Shea in Hartford, North Carolina. Thank you for being Free Speech TV frontline funders, and thank you for putting up this $20,000 match so that anybody who calls in today will see their donations doubled. This is wonderful. This is just a great way to end the week and to end the pledge drive, particularly because we're still behind. And you can't do that. You can't run a business without enough revenue. And Free Speech TV, you know, even though it's nonprofit, it's a business basically. You know, it's got employees, it's got rent, it's got to pay satellite fees and electricity bills and all that kind of stuff. And you and I are the ones helping make it happen. I contribute to Free Speech TV as well as, you know, putting a program on their air. I think it's important. I think frankly, I think it's vital. I think that we all should be donating to Free Speech TV. If you get value out of this network, kick in something, help out. Pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of other networks out there that give you the kind of quality programming you'll find on Free Speech TV. In fact, there aren't any. There's no other nonprofit network out there that does this. So call now, 877-378-8669, or go to freespeech.org and make your contribution anytime today. Whatever works for you, make your donation. Help us get over our goal finish line. Help us take it to the finish line, which ends today, and know that your gift will be doubled up to $20,000, which is just breathtaking. So there are premiums, of course, as always. I mention these every day, but they're worth repeating, I suppose. There's the Thom Hartmann University sticker, a proud student of Thom Hartmann University with a $20 gift, or the Free Speech TV clear sticker that you can put in your car window or in your home or on your mirror. There's the $20 Pride Cool See, a nice rainbow cup cooler, mug cooler, whatever you call it. With a $50 gift, there's the Summer of Solidarity tote bag, a nice canvas tote bag, well made, does a great job. With a $75 gift, there's the Free Speech TV baseball cap, or the official Thom Hartmann Program mug, not available anywhere else. With a $100 gift, Free Speech TV will make a contribution to the Black Trans Advocacy Coalition. With a $120 gift, you have your choice of a Free Speech TV t-shirt or my new book, The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. Doing the research for this book was so much fun. One of the things that I really love about writing these short, easily read, kind of just trying to lay out history for the lay audience, for average people, is that I get to do all the research and do all the, I spent hours reading old letters by Ben Franklin and reading, speeches and transcripts of salons in France by Iroquois and Huron Indians who went over there and spoke with them. It's incredible. So anyhow, that's with a $120 gift, that book, or the Free Speech TV t-shirt. With a $240 gift, there is the Free Speech TV virtual meet and greet, the Zoom meeting. And with a $1,000 gift, there is an in-person come to Portland. And like I keep saying, we're going to work this out. This is Louise's grand project to get people here, and we will figure it out in the near future. But all that said, the really important thing is to keep this network going and give them the ability to expand their programming. They just added one new program, Indian Country Today, which is just great. There are so many others. There's some great talent out there that really should be on this network. So, consider calling now, 877-378-8669. Please call now and make your contribution to Free Speech TV. Help us keep this wonderful network going for another quarter. Thanks so much.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
The sun is rich and gladly pays in golden hours, silver days, and long green weeks that never end. School's out. The time is ours to spend. There's Little League, hopscotch, the creek, and after supper, hide and seek. The livelong light is like a dream. Freckles come like flies to cream. It is summer. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jefferson Smith. I love summer. Landscape of the Fall of Icarus by William Carlos Williams. According to Bruegel, and I hope it's Bruegel, when Icarus fell, it was spring. A farmer was plowing his field. The whole pageantry of the year was awake, tingling near. The edge of the sea, concerned with itself. Sweating in the sun that melted the wing's wax insignificantly off the coast. There was a splash, quite unnoticed. This was Icarus drowning. It is summer, and it is a time to think about these times. In these times of, over the weekend, since this group gathered, an attempted rebellion, I guess an attempted rebellion is a rebellion, in Russia. And since you and I last spoke, a submarine for the ultra-wealthy, almost out of a tragic, ironically tragic script, plunged intentionally towards the Titanic and then ended very unintentionally. The Greeks told us a story. The Greeks told us a story of a man and his son who donned wings made of wax. And they flew, and he was warned not to fly too high. The boy flew too high, and the wings melted, and he fell to his demise. Turns out, the Greeks had it backwards. It wasn't the son, it wasn't the boy who had the hubris. In real life, it was the father. In real life, it was the would-be, reported, maybe not quite billionaire. It was the people who avoided and set aside safety concerns and got inside that submarine, not to solve a particular problem, but to spend $250,000 to see something really neat so they could tell a story of seeing something really neat. In an era of insufficient regulation, probably in general, a time when government has been under attack for 40 years, And for decades, the enterprise of solving problems together has been squarely and indirectly, as well as directly, under assault. And so there weren't particular regulations. After all, not many of us take submarines. They forgot the lesson of another allegory, but this one wasn't from the Greeks. This one was from 111 years ago, when an unsinkable ship, during an era before the New Deal, during an era before meaningful safety regulations on boats, went traveling into the cold sea. And after the Titanic sunk, multiple things happened. Ships were built more safely. There was a rule that there should be a lifeboat for everybody. I think the idea of a lifeboat for everybody is a pretty good idea. They decided to regulate radio waves because, see, the distress signal from the Titanic couldn't be heard because of radio noise. Marconi had more recently invented and developed the radio. That in an era of insufficient regulation, there was a tragedy based on hubris. And the story of the Titanic and the story of Ocean Gate, I guess called Ocean Gate because Watergate was taken, ended up reminding us, or maybe teaching us, the Greeks had it backwards. Because not only was it not the son, it was the wealthy father. It was not the joy that led to hubris. It was not the humility of youth, but maybe the arrogance of accomplishment. It was not the lack of experience. It was some experience, but insufficient. And it was an example of selfishness and greed and insufficient collective awareness of problems we have to solve together. And it turned out the problem wasn't going too high, it was sinking too low. Anchors went high, and Watergate, OceanGate, Titanic went low. I am Jeff Smith. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. It is an honor to be with you again. Thom will be back with us towards the end of the week. There is news, and I know it is primarily interesting. I mean, for the families involved, it is nothing to laugh about. It is 5 human beings that should be alive. Of course, we should also care about the hundreds of refugees who were stranded on a ship at the same time who received not as much attention. Of course, they hadn't had a James Cameron movie popularize their 1912 related tragedy. But also over the weekend, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner private security forces, started marching towards Moscow. After the Russian government, if we can call it that, had announced that they were going to conscript the Wagner forces. They were going to have them sign contracts with the government army rather than just with the private army. And after following much criticism from Prigozhin announced that they were going to march on Moscow. Made a deal at the very end. You probably caught this story over the weekend. It started and ended over the weekend, in between shows. I don't know if that's inconvenient or convenient. I suspect they did not consult our programming calendar when they arranged their plans. And there are multiple things we might learn from this. Reading the signals from Russian internal politics is tricky, and I will remain mostly humble in that. It is afterwards, if people missed the end of the story, Prigozhin made a deal. He has not yet showed up there. Made a deal that he would escape without prosecution, go to Belarus, and yes, the Wagner forces would join the Russian military. And we could opine about the impact on the Ukrainian invasion, attempted occupation, and war. We could speculate about the impacts it's going to have on Putin's ability to project power. I want to at least, because I'm more, not expert, at least aware of what's happening in the United States and of democracy, that a large private army ain't a great idea. That's just over there. Like, think of Blackwater for a moment, just a moment. We've been talking about OceanGate, and I mentioned Watergate and Titanic and delving in the deep. So there's another water. There's Blackwater. There is a private military force here. It's a reminder that a private military force might not always fulfill the objectives, that a mercenary, no matter how highly paid, isn't always better. And also, they might not have the same organizing purpose. In fact, that greed is an insufficient motivating force in the world. It's powerful, has impact, but is insufficient, and sometimes not so great. Before we try to pull a sliver out of our neighbor's eye, we should pull the beam out of our own eye. Call-in number here, 202-808-9925, 202-808-9925. Fresh Start Monday. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. What other news should we be tracking? 202-808-9925. What needs a fresh start? Dave from Federal Way, you are on the air.
Hey, Jefferson. Yeah, I think I just want to, amplify your main point. Instead of looking at what is going on in Russia, which is an enigma to say the least, okay, we should look at what would have happened in America if Donald Trump had been reelected. Him, General Flynn, Steve Bannon, the whole lot of them were planning on making a private military here to continue occupation in lands that were militarily occupied and not popularly. Okay, they were not popularly by anybody. Recruitment numbers in the military were crashing. They were crashing even really when Trump came into office, and it was because of these continued occupations. The idea was to have a private mercenary military to fill that role, to relieve regular citizens of that duty and that obligation, but it wouldn't have worked. I mean, something very similar would have happened here in America. I mean, I don't know. They were talking about Modi. They say don't call Modi an authoritarian. Right? Say because he's popular, right? Saddam Hussein was popular. I mean, authoritarians can be popular, Jefferson. The problem is they make decisions based on their own personal worldview. And they don't really care about anybody else's worldview. I mean, they even said Prigozhin's big sin and what he may not recover from is he said flat out the war in Ukraine was a fraud. It's the folly of one man. And that one man is Vladimir Putin. I mean, the same thing when we say Donald Trump is, like we talk about January 6th. They're saying it's a Fed surrection. They'll have every excuse in the book to not hold their furor, basically, Donald Trump responsible. And this is something that really worries me.
No, I appreciate it. And there's several things in there, Dave, but there are a couple that I do want to respond to. So I didn't mention Eric Prince, but I mentioned his company. I mentioned Blackwater. And you're absolutely right. And his sister was the head of our education system in the United States of America. And I shouldn't laugh about that because I don't think it's funny, but really? Really? Like the guy whose primary thing is building a huge private army his sister was trying to privatize the education system, and understand that that's what's going on. There are alternative systems to democracy, and there are alternative routes to power. And instead of the consent of the governed, it could be just owning stuff. Or just feudalism, just oligarchy and plutocracy, just kind of owning stuff. And if people want to do stuff, you have to let them do it because you own the stuff that they need. And they were moving and working to move towards a country that is more just about owning stuff. Right? The culture of property, but then expanding the importance of property to just about anything. And at the intersection of property control rather than democracy control of everything. Authoritarianism is one word for what you get to do if you just own everything. I get to be an authoritarian in my very small bathroom if I'm alone in there, and I get to boss around, I guess, I don't know, the sink. What happens if the sink is other people? What happens to institutions with the education system? What if it's the military? And what if it's the military? And you're absolutely right that the oligarchic rise in the world, that's what unites Trump and Putin and et cetera, is the rise of oligarchy rather than democratic institutions, the rise of that in the world. And that is the threat. And it's not just abroad, that is here. And we don't just have to watch it, we can do something about it. This is Thom Hartmann's show. This is your show. I'm Jeff.
Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com.
I am interested in what we think we should learn from these remarkable June stories. The submarine and the private army attack on one of the most powerful nations in the world. What should we learn? And not merely to poke fingers, not merely to scoff, not merely schadenfreude, not merely, aha, see, we're different than that, we can throw stones at others. But we should learn. Because if we believe in we the people, then we the people are supposed to be in charge, and therefore we have responsibility to figure out how we should do this better. What do we learn? I'd be genuinely interested in what you think we've learned. Telephone number is 202-808-8255. 9925, 202-808-9925. Also interested in what is happening with the Republican nomination. I'm interested in it. We saw a poll, I saw it over the weekend, it may have been last week, where Ron DeSantis, who had been the great hope of MAGA Republicans who didn't love Donald Trump or were worried that he might not win or concerned that he, in fact, was too much in cahoots with anti-American overseas oligarchs, too much compromised, even too much of a grifter for their taste. Their great hope was Ron DeSantis, not because he would moderate in ethnocentric policies, not because he would moderate in economic policies to, for instance, help the middle class and regular Americans rather than just the extremely wealthy. But it turns out that he has now dropped further 9 points in the polls, and the speculation is, well, because people are now getting to meet him. And he's the MAGA without the Trump. Now, some people thought that that was going to be cool. Well, it turns out the people who like the MAGA maybe think it's not as cool. I mean, I'm not an expert in Trumpocracy. I'm an avid and dismayed viewer of it and commenter upon it, and hopefully minor combatant against it. But, you know, this little guy with his squeaky voice, who nonetheless manages to be really grumpy and talk about how Florida's where woke goes to die. Come on, man. It's not even that great a line. It's used it way too many times already. Most people don't even know what that means. You invented the definition of it after a bunch of people stole it from the black community. Come on, man. So Ron DeSantis has been on, he's had his, he comes out with a campaign video where Donald Trump is Darth Vader and Ron DeSantis is Obi-Wan Kenobi after Obi-Wan Kenobi has defeated, I should say, Anakin Skywalker on the lava banks of Mustafar, if I can recall where that is for my Star Wars nerd friends out there. I'm among you. And Obi-Wan gives the speech, you were the chosen one. You were supposed to restore balance. You're not supposed to become a Sith. Well, they got that backwards too. Because he's trying to say that, well, no, he's the real maggot. He has to take down the thing, and I get the metaphor, but it was just so cringeworthy. And by the way, like, he's sort of the Darth Vader he's sort of the Anakin Skywalker generationally relative to, it just was sort of backwards. He was on top of the hill, so we got to be taller. I don't just mean make height jokes. It's not nice. I don't height jokes, just height comments. Little bullies don't bother me more than big bullies, but I don't know. It's a little funnier. And I don't think that guy's he might not be able to do it. I think the DeSantis great hope might not be able to do it. Right now, Donald Trump, after being federally indicted and actually found liable for a case rooted in sexual assault, that after that, he's polling 51% among Republicans. By the way, usually that is covered as a story about Donald Trump. That is not a story about Donald Trump. That is a story about Republicans. He doesn't elect himself in that crew. It's not about him. We make it so much about him. Even I talk about him, but it's ultimately not about Donald Trump. It's about the people who responded to the polls saying, yeah, I'm still down with that guy. It's about Breitbart. It's about Fox News. It's about a media landscape controlled by oligarchs. It's about deeply rooted racism in this country they can tap into so that people avoid the fact that someone is truly anti-American in the best and most obvious senses, both. Not just the best senses, also the most obvious senses. Like, he's not on our side on important stuff. He's on his side or literally against us, and he violates the essence of what's best about the country. He's anti-American. And nonetheless, they're with him. Stick with him. And a media landscape that supports that either shines attention on him or just apologizes for them and propagandizes for them. And a movement that has made its primary enemy an opposing political movement, not an opposing set of political objectives, not the advancement of some political objectives. If we were going to say what MAGAism stands for, what it wants to accomplish in the world that it wants to see, the America it wants to make great again, what do they even mean? I know they'll say freedom. I get that part. I know they'll say, like, keep more people south of the border. I know they'll say that. But really, what is the viewpoint of how to rebuild an American middle class? What are we going to do about a Texas that right now, in June, not July, is having straight 101, 102, 103, 104, I believe 105 degree days? Not in July, not in August, but in June. That what's happening with the Republican nomination is a reflection, less, I would argue, of Donald Trump and more of that movement, more of that media landscape, more of the Republican Party. We'll be back. I'm Jeff Smith.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. Telephone number 202-808-9925.
It's a collection of essays. This one is by David Gilbert on page 31, titled "The System Within the System, the Prison Industrial Complex and Imperialism." For those of us held behind locked gates within the walls and fences topped with razor wire, the corrections regime is the system that works tirelessly to impose total control over every aspect of our lives. Yet as ponderous and powerful as prisons are, they're only one part, a central girder, of a much bigger and more foreboding house of horrors, which can most accurately be named imperialism. The structural needs of the larger edifice set the specifications for the size and position of the girder. The strength of the girder helps determine how long the building itself will stand. We can't understand the explosion of imprisonment in the United States since 1971 without looking at an imperialism's urgent needs and goals of that period. By the same token, we can't develop an effective program around the prison industrial complex without grappling with the stresses and trends of the larger system of imperial rule. To be clear, before you take time to read this chapter, I don't offer any brilliant ideas on strategy. Those will most likely emerge from the organizing and activist efforts themselves. However, some of the concerns discussed may raise questions that go into forming strategy. I definitely look forward to learning from the dialogues that this generates on these issues. Imperialism may sound like the kind of rhetoric we want to avoid, but it's one word that needs to be rescued as the best way to name the system that rules over us. The basis of imperialism is the relentless quest for profits around the globe. Its most striking characteristic is the colossal and grotesque polarization of wealth. That polarization happens between nations, between the rich countries of the North and the impoverished ones of the global South, the impoverished countries of Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, and at the same time within each country based on class, race, and gender. The poles of dazzling wealth and abject poverty are intimately linked, as the former results from the ruthless plunder of the latter. This system is built on and intensifies all the major forms of oppression: patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy, all of which are structurally central. At the same time, imperialism highlights the global character of the system in a way that explains why the most intense oppression and resistance have been in the South, and that also provides the context for why the liberation struggles of the various people of color have been in the forefront within the U.S. There's no way to capture what the system costs in human life and potential, the pain and loss for all of us. Close to 1 billion human beings suffer chronic hunger, while another 2 billion face nutritional deficiencies. 1 billion lack access to clean drinking water. Just looking at children under the age of 5, imperialism is a holocaust in progress. Over 9 million die every year from easily preventable causes associated with poverty. The price for future generations may be even more severe as the rapaciousness of this global frenzy for profits threatens the very ecological basis for sustaining human life on any scale on our planet. Since most people won't accept living in squalor amid plenty, imperialism entails both the most sophisticated and the most brutal forms of social control. Its most salient feature is war, war after war after war, mainly against the peoples of the South. The domestic front line of such repression is a truly violent and harmful prison industrial complex. Today, 2,300,000 people are held behind bars, about 7 times the number in 1971. That explosion was unprecedented, coming after a 70-year period when the rates of imprisonment had remained more or less constant. This dramatic change did not result from some sudden skyrocketing of criminal activity, but rather from a radical expansion of what was designated as a crime and a draconian increase in the punishments for those crimes. Such extreme measures were driven by considerations way beyond criminal justice and often at cross purposes to the proclaimed goal of public safety. These destructive changes were born from crisis, one much more severe and protracted than the periodic ups and downs of the business cycles that occur over a roughly 10-year period, but rather a situation that threatened the very survival of the system. Such structural crises occur because capitalism is by its nature unstable. The economy is vast and complicated, but the major decisions are made by a tiny corporate and financial elite, with each thinking only of his own profits. When a structural crisis develops, the long-term institutional arrangements that assured a reliable flow of profits and the rule of capital no longer function. One dramatic example was the Great Depression of the 1930s, followed by World War II. At the end of that period, a new set of international institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were created. At the same time, a new deal was hammered out for the terms of the bargain between capital and labor within the U.S. Those arrangements worked well for capital until they broke down a generation later. That new structural crisis, which emerged between 1968 and 73, is the seedbed for the burgeoning of the prison industrial complex and many related changes in U.S. history. The first and most obvious signs were political, as the resistance to imperialism crested in 1968. Abolition now.
Did you know that every weekday we send out an email before the show giving you all the topics coming up so you can be fully informed and ready to interact with our program? Or that after the show we send out Sue's Stack, a list of every topic I've discussed along with clickable hot links to every source of information I've shared with you on the air? It's all completely free and available over at thom.tv, THOM.tv. Check it out.
Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Jefferson Smith. Thanks for being with us. In the co-pilot seat, and by that I mean my lap, is in fact George Bailey, the nearly 12-year-old Puggle, the dog. It was a word I had a hard time saying earlier on, that as a man working to recover from my own toxic masculinity, saying the word Puggle was a challenging thing for me to come to grips with. Now, it's hard for me to imagine how many things I've come to grips with respect to this ridiculous dog. Let's get to your calls. Let's go straight to Frank from Thompson Falls, Montana. Go ahead, Frank.
Morning, Jefferson. I can appreciate your dog. I'm a guy that takes and makes dog treats and takes them to everybody's dogs, and I don't even own a dog.
There you go. There you go.
But anyway, answer to your question is, living where I live, I ask this question all the time of people, and it's like, what do you want? And they just want to own the libs. They want to change the government, and they consider themselves the ultimate patriots, but yet they're the most unpatriotic people on the planet. They don't have...
No, it's tangled up. It is not thought through. Donald Trump is its apotheosis. He is its manifestation. He is its Frankenstein's monster that a challenge they've got is at the fundament, at the root of much of what they want to accomplish, it's unpopular. Like, ultimately, most people don't want an economy that's not good for most people. Most people don't want an economy that's only good for a few people. It's not what most people want. Most people don't want their fundamental freedoms abridged. Most people want women to have bodily autonomy. Most people want that. Most people don't just want the United States to work for white people. Most people don't want that. And so if you want what most people don't want, you got to figure out how to navigate power. First of all, wield power in ways that most people don't get to weigh in, just do it through ownership. Second of all, try to hoodwink most people by owning the media, etc., and try to get them so mad and or so scared that they're really not thinking about what's in the community's interest, what's better for everybody, what's better for most people, and hopefully get them mad at just a few of the most people. Go ahead, you had something else to say before I move on.
Got a police department. We got to get rid of the fire department. We got to get rid of, taking care of our roads and stuff like that. And they'll say, well, no way. And I go, well, that's a socialist system.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
So it's crazy.
Yeah.
Because they, like I say, they don't. I belong to a charity over here, and this is a prime example. We had a fundraiser here at Memorial Day, and it was midnight, and a band was playing, and the band played Jimi Hendrix's Star Spangled Banner, and I would say 2/3 of the people got up, stood there, took their hats off, and I'm sitting there going, do you realize that that's like an anti-national anthem that Hendrix did? It's not pro, but, I mean, I was amazed and stunned that all those people would do that at midnight, Well, but
Frank,
that's their philosophy.
Frank, thank you for the call. We're going to keep it cracking with Tyrone and Harlem. Go ahead, Tyrone.
Hi, thanks for taking my call, Mr. Smith.
Man, thanks for calling.
It's all right. I know it's been said time and time again that the first casualty of war is the truth.
Yeah.
And this Prigozhin, the one that's in charge of the Wagner Group, said that the reason why this war took place in Ukraine, not because of 2014 and the overthrow of the democratic election or the encroachment of NATO. He said it's pure greed because they stand to gain the most out of a destroyed Ukraine, these oligarchs. And so this is why this thing is going on. Now, this guy's not the most honest person that need to be believed, but I mean, it makes more sense to me that Russia and the oligarchs would stand the gain from the destruction of Ukraine. Yeah. And the fact that we are overlooking the fact that this man has put it out there, and the fact that I hear political scientists and all of them, the United States is the worst. The United States is the reason why this war is going on. Because they have an axe to grind with the United States and how they have responded to certain incidents, that they just wholeheartedly believe that the United States is the only reason why this whole Ukrainian situation is as bad as it is. And is not paying attention to the fact that these people have their own motive. They have their own reason why they're doing what they do. And the private army, I know, I feel that was Ron DeSantis. He had this dictator tendency. And I know he wanted $100 million for his own army in Florida. And I'm saying, listen, I can see this man turning roughshod against, he already have done things that if you can't read certain books, can't love who you love, you can't do this, that, and the other thing. That's a dictatorship. That's a dictator type of mindset that this man have shown to me. And we need to pay attention to the fact that the power that we giving people is the same power that could turn against us, just like it did in Russia. He didn't expect for these people to come down there talking about we coming to Moscow. Yeah. And we need to understand we putting people in power. We voting these people in because we don't like certain people. I don't like the LGBT. I don't like. We're setting up our own demise, and we better pay attention, to what's happening in Russia and all these other countries, and the fact that we're putting these people in. Donald Trump fomented an insurrection on our government, and we still want him as president.
No.
What's wrong with us?
No, you and I both laugh, and it's probably not a good thing to laugh at, but like really,
No!
like what?
Unbelievable.
It doesn't pass a straight face test. But Tyrone, I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you said that. And not only about the January 6th stuff, but before that, let's watch Russia's move. Right, Russia's move for years has been, don't worry about how your life is working in Russia. Just think about how bad the West is. Think about how bad the United States is. Think about how bad America is. Think about that, and that will help consolidate power. That is the same move that the MAGA Republicans that Donald Trump has been using in the United States. Rather than saying, here's what we've got to do to reestablish the middle fundamental freedoms. Here's what we've got to do for a 21st century worthy education system. Here's what we've got to do for a healthcare system that's actually a healthcare system that you can sort of navigate and actually get healthier, not just sick care for a few people. Instead of solving those problems, just be mad at the woke liberals. Just don't like them, and then you wield power without having to solve problems. It's the same move.
Yes. And what I've seen, even from when they started welfare, they started Social Security, they started the GI Bill, they started that to help white people only. This is what the system was, so-called white people only. Because I don't believe that black and white. I believe that they're so-called. There are people that are mixed in all the ethnicities. But
sure.
That's because the same thing with, like I said, it's easier for me to set up a system that's going to disadvantage other people because it makes me feel better, and it makes other people work against the less fortunate.
Yep.
And if you're gonna set up a system to actively work towards decimating the less fortunate, and you feel like, oh well, I'm the fortunate group, yeah, you're gonna get that so-called fortunate group to help you disadvantage the people that's disadvantaged.
There you go, Tyrone.
So we have to get more educated on how we're dealing with the system, and know when we see what we see, but we believe that. Hold on, you telling me that you hate LGBTQ? Why? Because I know that hatred is only going to come back to me. I know it's only a matter of time, because hatred, give it some time. It don't discriminate.
Yeah, no, poison doesn't turn into sunshine, right? That's not how it works, right? You just keep spreading poison, you're going to beget bad things. Tyrone, thank you so much for calling, man. Appreciate the wisdom.
Thanks for taking my call.
Yeah, be well. Scott from Seattle. It's your turn.
Hi, Jefferson. Thank you for taking my call.
What's up?
I called you once before.
I appreciated it then as well. And I appreciate it now, Scott. That is your real name. Go on, sorry.
Yes, it is my real name.
All right.
Yes, it is. I want to ask if we can tell all of your listeners, particularly the younger ones who may not remember as far back as I can. I took my political science classes in the mid-1970s. And what I want to say is that the Republicans are not like they used to be. Back then, I can imagine asking Republicans, any Republicans, what should we do if Russian troops pour over the border to take over some independent neighboring nation just so their leader can pretend he's the greatest czar of all? I know what the Republicans would have said. Or if I could say now, what should we do about an American public figure who's managed to reach office, and instead of enforcing law and order under the Constitution, he's actively trying to take it apart so he can substitute his dictatorial whims? I know what the Republicans would have said back then.
Sure.
I know it.
Sure. No, there's been sometimes gradual and sometimes rapid change of the Republican Party over the last 150 years since it started, and just about 150 years, and it's not. And for those who would root for the Republican Party not to do well, it's still not good news, because we actually want a pro-democracy consensus in the country, or something at least close to it.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
202-808-9925, 202-808-9925. We'll be back with your calls. David, you win the Most Patient Listener Award from Miami Beach, Florida. You're on the air.
don't worry. It's North Miami Beach, which has no beach, but thank you. Yes,
North Miami Beach. No, wait. For those of us who are limited in our geographic understanding, and that includes me, North Miami Beach, I do see the N here. I forget, I neglected to say N Miami Beach, and I would have known that I said it out loud that N didn't mean N meant North. That said, so I could have corrected that. But without your experience, without your scholarship, without your
hard-earned experience, yes.
your hard-earned experience, I would not know that North Miami Beach, not very far north, at least in the United States context, and doesn't have a beach apparently?
We had briefly, it's now in Surfside, which is also now infamous for that condominium that collapsed 2 years ago. Right.
Oh, all right.
Right.
Very good. Well,
Yes,
you did
sir.
not. You. I appreciate the geography lesson, but that I presume is not why you called. So go on.
Don't worry, it gets worse. Yes, sir. Since I used to be a gifted elementary teacher and you are a gifted speaker, I hope everybody has seen not just the looming tower about 9/11, but Cameron's documentary Ghost of the Abyss. How at the end he's used one mini sub to rescue another, and then his submersible rises, but it's 9/11. So he goes from a failure of design, the Titanic, with iron rivets and a rudder that's too small, to 9/11, where the Twin Towers, for all the things that went wrong, they were so well built, they did not topple over as clearly the attackers intended, keeping down the death count to 3,000 initially. Clearly, they were designed to topple over in opposite directions. Because all the columns inside were replaced with reinforcements outside, that saved lives. Unfortunately, the submersible Titan, remember, not a real submarine because it can't really steer much, it had no such thoughts because they replaced hardened steel, proven, with the unproven mix of carbon fiber and titanium. Open up an old-fashioned thermostat. You have two pieces of metal that with different melting points. That's how they work, and that's great. Basically, the Titan submersible was one oversized thermostat, which did its job ultimately. And I feel especially bad for the historian that was on board. So that's your history lesson.
I appreciate it very much.
I'm a systems analyst.
I appreciate it very much. And I want to get back also to your first point, and maybe even ask you to repeat it.
Sir.
But the unproven sort of carbon fiber compound, instead of having material that is all one, right? Whether it's steel or whether it's titanium, all titanium, or whether it's something that can be molded, right? Instead, it was something that was more spun, more wound, more sort of infused, and that meant the particulates could get in there and gradually degrade. And the reason it could pass an internal, not a third party, but sort of an internal safety test early on, was because it gradually that design meant it could gradually degrade and then implode over time, not on its first dive, but on a subsequent one and a deeper one. That music means it's time for me to say thank you. Go ahead, David. Say your last half a word.
Daedalus would be proud. Yes.
David, thank you so much. We'll be right back with Thom Hartmann Show.
Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us.
And we are back. I want to go to Gavin from New York City. Go ahead, Gavin.
Hello, Mr. Jefferson.
Hello.
Hey, I would just like to support the message that I do believe that everybody is invested in a better America, and I don't think that any one side is invested in some kind of a purge scenario. Like, I think both sides just want to be respected for their opinion, and I think that speech is the way that we go about doing that. So in that regard, I really appreciate your program.
Well, I appreciate your call.
No problem. So the question I had was, so now that we have a labor crisis,
yeah,
right? The labor crisis is in fact related to the immigration crisis, right? And so now the question then becomes, it's sort of because the people that the immigrants would be competing with are the people that are generally marginalized in the society already.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we mitigate the fact that we want higher wages? Like, we don't want people working 60 hours a week to pay rent. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So we have to restrict labor. We have to. Mm-hmm. So how do we, I was just asking your opinion, how do we mitigate the need for continued immigration? Because America is an immigrant country, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know? And the fact that there are still people, especially those people who have been disenfranchised or those people who have suffered under bad policies on both sides, that are, you know, trying to re-engage society, and they end up in a situation, because I think most of the pushback to immigration is generally from the people who would be competing with them in the labor market. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think I heard your question. Yeah, how do we address getting additional supply in the labor market without having that additional supply, meaning everybody works 1.5 time? Is that a fair characterization?
And wages go down.
Yeah. So I would say a couple things. First of all, I want to add something to the context, and I think one of the things that has been under-publicized, under-discussed, is just the demographic drivers of this. And it genuinely is surprising to me that this isn't a regular part of the discussion and sort of a consistent part of the understanding. And it's surprising to me because when I was a kid, it was predicted. It was, for years, we were saying, oh, there's going to be a retirement of baby boomers, and that's going to create significant shifts, maybe even upheaval in labor markets, because there are going to be, when you have a 66-year-old or a 62-year-old who retires early, and they won't be replaced by quite as many 46-year-olds or 42-year-olds, because my generation, Generation X, is not as numerous as the baby boom generation. This was not a surprise. And COVID led to I think helped speed up that process, both because it felt like kind of a time warp, right? But it felt like it was 2.5 years or whatever inside of a month. But also because it probably sped up. Well, if I'm staying home anyway, I might as well stay home. It perpetuated some of that. And so I want to add to the context just that it's not the whole part of the answer, but it's a big part of the answer, so that demographic context. But generally speaking, I just want to endorse what you already said, which is that in any business, in any sports team, right, in any church, recruitment is an important part.
Obviously.
Like recruitment is a really important part. If you're a salesperson, if you're a marketer, it's recruitment of customers. If you're a salesperson, it's actually recruitment of customers that actually make repeat purchases. If you are in HR or if you are in actual recruitment, it's to get more people who will work for your company. If you are, I mean, heck, some of the most, and I'm a sports fan, and the most effective and successful college teams there are successful because they recruit. And that doesn't mean they let everybody, but generally speaking, you want to recruit somehow.
Yeah,
We've created a culture where we're not recruiting. Go ahead.
One thing I will say that I think is not really appreciated a lot of times when the debate about even the folks walking up from Guatemala, like, you do not understand the chutzpah it takes to walk across a continent.
Yes.
Nobody is coming here to lay down after walking.
People in our country drive 6 blocks to go to the grocery store, and I'm not saying I'm special among them. Like, these people are willing to, if somebody's willing to walk across a nation, am I sure I don't want their help? Yeah, I would enforce the laws to make sure they're not doing, dastardly things. Obviously, but if somebody has that kind of commitment, do I really want to keep them out?
Yeah, but I mean, obviously, I think most of that is generally a cultural issue where something that might be okay in your, like, education is very necessary, acclimation is very necessary, but we also need to mitigate the people that we have here that are disenfranchised versus the people that we're bringing here to literally be disenfranchised. Because if you get off one of the buses from Guatemala, you are disenfranchised by definition.
Yeah.
So we have to make sure that whatever it is that we do in order to deal with this is an American thing to do. Like, I mean, we've had floods of immigrants before. It's just, I guess this is not maybe necessarily the view that we most prefer.
Well, Gavin, let me say one thing before we go to break, and that is, and I think even a topic maybe near and dear to your heart, or at least according to the person who passed your name along to me, and that is that that we also have people who could be part of the workforce if we reformed our system of giving people a second chance. That's what I'm talking about. That in our state, and not just immigrants, right, but people also who were born in the United States, who in Oregon we passed ban the box. So there's on the front page of many employment forms, there would be a box that says check this box if you have committed a felony. And merely by banning the box, we say, no, don't have that. You can that can be part of the story, be part of the interview. But how about not the first page? How about not the first interaction? Let's make sure we judge people in the totality of their life rather than merely by their worst moment. And there are people who we will be made better if we can make sure people have a real second chance. That's not just for their benefit. That's not just for kind morality. That's even out of collective selfishness. We'll be better off for that. Last 2 words from you.
Okay. Yeah, God bless America.
Thanks, Gavin. God bless America. Be well.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the HartmannReport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported, wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Unsettling Truths, the Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery by Mark Charles and Soon-Chan Ra. This is from Chapter 1. You cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. I, Mark, said this almost under my breath as I walked past a line of men dressed as Spanish sailors from the 1490s. I was in front of Union Station in Washington, D.C., near the massive statue of Christopher Columbus overlooking the United States Capitol. Every Columbus Day, there's an official ceremony in this plaza honoring Columbus as the discoverer of America. I had stumbled upon this ceremony by accident the year prior. There were a few non-natives holding signs and protesting the ceremony, but nothing very disruptive. I went back the following year primarily out of curiosity. I wasn't intending to protest, nor did I want to make a scene. As I walked up behind the statue and approached the group of men dressed as Spanish sailors, the words just came out of my mouth. You cannot discover lands already inhabited. As I walked further down the line, I said it again, this time a little louder. You cannot discover lands already inhabited. As I continued walking, I came to the front of the line where a group of men dressed in suits were standing. I repeated myself, making sure they could hear me. "You cannot discover lands already inhabited." "Suck it up," was the reply I heard as I kept walking. By this time, I'd walked around the statue and reached the front where a small stage had been erected and chairs set up for people to watch the ceremony. It hadn't started yet, but more than half the audience was seated waiting for it to begin. So I stopped near the center, turned toward the crowd, and in a calm but loud voice I said to the people, "You cannot discover lands already inhabited. That process is known as stealing, conquering, or colonizing. The fact that America calls what Columbus did discovery reveals the implicit racial bias of the country, that Native Americans are not fully human." Quickly, one of the white men dressed in a suit walked over and interrupted me. "You are not welcome here," he said as he grabbed my arm and began walking me away. I attempted to explain the inappropriateness of both celebrating this holiday as well as hosting this ceremony, but instead of engaging in conversation, he threatened me with arrest and escorted me from the area. As I walked away from the gathering, I was amused at his words and the irony of their context. A white man participating in a public ceremony honoring Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of America, telling a native man he was not welcome in that space. How did a flawed assumption about the place of the indigenous population in U.S. society become normative? How are assumptions so deeply ingrained in the American psyche and imagination that dysfunctional and oppressive actions emerge? How did a dysfunctional idea and worldview form that allows for the displacement of native bodies? One of the explanations for the formation of this dysfunctional worldview is the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is a set of legal principles that govern the European colonizing powers, particularly during the administration of indigenous land, regarding the administration. It is the primary legal precedent that still controls native affairs and rights, and international law formulated in the 15th and 16th centuries. From a theological perspective, the legal and political role of the doctrine of discovery is rooted in a dysfunctional theological imagination that shaped the European colonial settler worldview. The doctrine emerged from a series of 15th century papal bulls, which are official decrees by the Pope that carry the full weight of his ecclesiastical office. On June 18, 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Dum Diversus, which initiated the first set of documents that would compose the doctrine of discovery. The official decree of the Pope granted permission to King Alfonso V of Portugal, quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, Muslims, and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever, held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his or their use and profit. End of quote from Pope Nicholas's papal bull of 1452. Dum Diversus would identify the Saracens, a common term for Muslims at the time, and pagans, essentially identifying any non-Christians as others, as those who could be targeted for, quote, perpetual slavery. The papal bull intentionally used language that identified those outside the European Christian world and enforced the Western theological imagination of non-Europeans as other. The Portuguese took these ecclesiastical statements to heart and perpetrated the slave trade from the African continent to the European and the American continents. As a Christian ruler, the King of Portugal would have power endowed from the church to take possession of the other as slave labor from the continent of Africa. The pagan African body was just another commodity to be taken for the pleasure and profit of the European Christian body, the one made most fully in the image of God. In the January of 1454, Pope Nicholas authored another bull. The book is Unsettling Truths by Charles and Ra.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And thank you to Carol for your citation of Ovid. They both distrust the advice of heaven, but what harm will it do to try? You would suppose that men had conspired to be wicked, but all men speedily feel that vengeance, which they deserve to endure, for such is my determination. I wish I had not been acquainted with the future. Where is our hubris? Where is our greed getting us into trouble? Right now, it is Second Chance Monday at 10:30, we're going to be talking to District Attorney Mike Schmidt about what's happening to try to improve our community safety systems and on how progressive district attorneys are being targeted for defeat in the coming election. And I should say better, Fresh Start Monday. Right now is the time for your calls. Right now, we are going to harvest the wisdom of the crew that listens to this show. One of the reasons I'm so grateful to be able to do this, because we learn things. I learn things every time. We're going to hear from Laura, who's going to give us a view of the Republican primary through Iowa eyes. We're going to hear from Brian, who's going to talk to us about the competitive nature of people in politics. Lewis is going to remind us of the story of Icarus. Dale, talk to us about Ukraine and Republicans supporting democracy. Bob, some about the Wagner Group. Ziggy might have for us a legal question, and Pearson talking about the Republicans' plan, or maybe their lack of one. Let's first go to Laura from Marion, Iowa. Go ahead, Laura.
Hey, Jefferson. The GOP primary is clearly visible to us here. We're seeing a lot. You see most of the advertising on I see it on the local ABC affiliate. Mm-hmm. And surprisingly, I see the most ads from Scott.
Interesting.
And the initial part of his ad is quite compelling, and then you get a little further into it, and he talks about the evil left, and that's where I left him. But we're seeing a lot of that.
Yeah.
We also see DeSantis, and in my opinion, his commercials are cartoonish.
Yeah.
Clearly running against Disney.
Yeah.
And those are about the only ads I'm seeing. The one other thing I want to throw out there, we're seeing no ads from the Democratic Party. And that has to do with the fact that they changed the schedule for the caucuses. Iowa now basically has no support from the National Democratic Party. We don't have the offices coming in that were with the presidential candidates. We don't have any media. There's no staffers on the ground. So we're on our own. I don't think the Democratic Party is worried about our 4 electoral votes, and so the funding just is gone.
So you said a couple things I want to get into. I want to do the second one first, which is for everybody who's a precinct person watching, pushing for a 50-state strategy the way Howard Dean did, pushing for an every county, every election, every nook and cranny of this country, building a pro-democracy movement in the country. Like if you're looking for building of a true pro-democracy party, that's the kind of stuff to be for. And if you don't know what a precinct person is out there, essentially it is the building block of political party. It's the person who is elected. Very often to be elected, you just got to raise your hand. But it is the people who are elected by precinct, and then they comprise the sort of fundament of the political party, whatever the political party is, but typically Democratic and Republican. And as Laura's talking, she's talking about the Democratic Party. So that's the first thing. That how do we build that an election-driven movement is an insufficient movement, and a movement that all it cares about is winning the next election is not a movement sufficiently worthy of its power. Now, if you're a political consultant, that's your job. Unfortunately, you're doing that not merely for movement reasons, but maybe for a little bit of greed as well. If you are building a political party, whatever political party is, it shouldn't be merely about acquiring power. It should be about solving problems and then being a part of the community. So that's the first thing I want to say. And kudos to the people who work in the community. They're trying to build movements that actually aren't only about the acquisition of power, but about helping people. The other thing I wanted to continue to get from you, Laura, is your sort of insight into, or at least your bird's-eye view of the Iowa Republican primary. You said that Tim Scott is doing the most ads. Ron DeSantis running against Disney. Sort of a funny enemy to pick, right? It's sort of a funny enemy to pick.
Yes.
But and I think it's partly because they're so terrified of picking Trump as their enemy, right? They want to kind of make it about Biden, but that doesn't differentiate any of them. And the opponent they have to beat now is Donald Trump. I think their strategy, as far as I can tell, with the exception of Chris Christie and maybe Asa Hutchinson, I think their strategy is hope that Trump is brought down himself or is brought down by the legal system, and they can be the last human standing and maybe thread this needle betwixt seeming independent of Trump a little bit, but also be the one that's most likely to get all the Trump Confederates to support them, and maybe even get his blessing. Any other things you're noticing in the Republican primary in Iowa? Any candidate that's surprising you, either with their lack of ability to get any traction or with their ability to get traction?
Well, I do like what I hear coming out of Chris Christie's mouth, because he is willing to call out the things he determines are ridiculous.
Yeah.
But the only coverage I'm seeing of Christie or the non-Trump candidates is coming out of the Cedar Rapids Gazette, which is a newspaper, and we actually know how many people read newspapers now, so he's probably not getting much coverage.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and he'll end up...
The other thing I would tell you...
Go ahead, please.
The other thing I would tell you is the part of Iowa that I live in, I'm in the Cedar Rapids area,
yeah.
And Cedar Rapids and Des Moines and Iowa City are the most liberal places in Iowa. And by that I mean, if you were to come to my driveway and I were to drive you 1 mile in any direction, any street you wanted to take, you would get to see an awesome Trump 2024 sign, or the "Don't Tread on Me" people, or the Biden that they hate Biden. So even though we're the most liberal place, it's like 51-49.
Right. It ain't 70-30. I get it. Lewis, we got about 60 seconds before break. The floor is yours. Lewis, can you hear me?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Good to hear from Jeff. I've got very interesting connection between Icarus and the deep dive vehicle vessels disaster. I would never have seen that. I love you and Tom for that, for doing things like that. And I'm sure it probably hit the back of your mind, but I heard during the earliest reports that the wife of one of the billionaire fathers and mother of one of the sons pointed out that her son, even since the beginning of the project and then wanting to get into it, had some bad feelings or discomfort about wanting to go, and kept expressing it to his father, that maybe he shouldn't go on this deep dive, and I don't want to go myself.
Yeah.
And up to the point of the dive, I guess, and what she said is the father talked him into it, or he went just out of like love, care, or whatever, or worry about his father's safety.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, it's the irony that you talk about this inverse of that diving.
Yeah.
He's told by devil, if you go too high, your wax melts your wings, you're going to dive to your death. Diving in another way now, and here's the son telling the father that, and it happened as an actuality from what this woman says. Interesting. I don't know what to say from that, but caught my attention. If you hadn't brought that up, I wouldn't have seen that in that process. So,
no, and I appreciate it. And I should have caught that connection because, I'm now looking at the Daily Mail. There's other people that have the story, but there was a son, the last people to give up their seats as well. The son convinced the father. So maybe Daedalus Nickworth got it backwards, not only geographically, but in terms of relationship dynamics.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. We're back with your calls. We're going to go to Ziggy from Oneonta, New York. It was the name of my elementary school, but it wasn't in New York. Go ahead, Ziggy.
Hey, Jefferson, Mr. Smith goes to Hartman land.
Going somewhere. We'll see where.
All right. Hey, as the attorney of record for the Thom Hartmann Show, I have a legal strategy question for you. Everyone thinks that Trump is going to be delaying everything with every motion to delay the trial as much as possible, taking it each time to the Supreme Court. And I thought to myself, actually, if he were to flip his strategy and instead demand that he have a speedy trial by the 14th of August, the government will not be able to provide them with the classified information by that time. And therefore, he could request that the trial either be a mistrial or that he be acquitted because the prosecution hasn't given the full bill of particulars. What's your thought on that as an attorney?
It's a good question. So first of all, obligatory disclaimer, not practicing law. Do have thoughts.
Okay.
I find the timing questions fascinating. And it gets then to the questions about the judge. Because it's interesting. Well, I'm going to give a weird analogy. I don't know if anybody ever saw Hunt for Red October. Okay, minor spoiler alert in Hunt for Red October. There's a time in the in Hunt for Red October, I'm pretty sure I'm getting the movie right, where instead of trying to get away from the attacking sub, they go towards the attacking sub, and that seems crazy. Mm-hmm. And they go towards they start moving directly towards the torpedoes that are bearing down in their submarine. And it's like, why would you go towards the torpedoes? Well, it was because they were able to get to them before the torpedoes had time to arm. And so so usually you think that delay and most of the dynamic around the Trump trial is imagining that the strategy from Trump will be to try to delay until, let's say, after the election, and where they might be able to have more control of the Department of Justice, for instance. And you just made the case, well, maybe, what if they tried to go even closer to the attacking torpedo before it had time to arm? Here's why I think that's a dangerous strategy. And I hope at least you're impressed with my Hunt for Red October analogy. But here's why I think it's a dangerous strategy, is because there will be a judge there, and then I'll get to the judge. There'll be a judge there who will say, and then Jack Smith will say, hey, no, we're very glad that the defendant is ready to go right now. We too want a speedy trial, and we're ready to go. So one risk is that they'll have their torpedoes armed pretty quickly. The other is they'll be able to say, but of course we have to abide by X, Y, and Z. Of course we got to maintain confidentiality of confidential records, and of course we've got to make sure we have a legitimate trial. So we're ready to go fast, but not quite that fast. Not quite that fast. And then one would imagine a reasonable judge, I use the word reasonable on purpose, a reasonable judge would say, okay, we might not do it quite that fast, we'll still do it pretty fast. And then what you'd get, and then you couldn't say, and then Trump's counsel would have a very hard time saying, well, no, we didn't mean fast that way. If we can't do it as fast as we want to wait a year. Well, the judge's not going to do that. Well, you already said you'd be ready. So I think it would be a dangerous game. This gets back, though, to the question of the judge, because how much will the judge, who Trump appointed, be in Trump's pocket? That's a question that she's going to have to demonstrate and answer to by her conduct. But I appreciate the call. Thank you, Ziggy. We're right back.
Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them.
And we are back. Let's go to Brian from Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Hey, good day.
Hello.
I always enjoy when you guest host. I like your wide-ranging topics.
Thanks, man.
And
others might say lack of focus, but it's fine. We'll keep going. Go ahead.
I like to frame it this way. I wish all political radio would focus more on the future, and I mean the way out future, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. And I think it would help refocus our politics on what's important.
That's interesting.
Instead of the daily squabbling and outrage and shock and lie that just goes on and on and on, which has been going on in mankind forever. It's like the human race is on this, 100,000-mile journey. We like to argue about what happened the last 1,000 miles. We want to argue about the next 50 feet, but we don't talk about where we want to end up in 100 years. We don't talk about it. I know it's fancy in a way. It's a flight of fancy, or however you phrase it, but I think it's important.
Yeah.
Because we live in a changing world. It's always changing. The climate's always changing. Yes, we're putting way too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, among other chemicals, of course. But in my mind, it's amazing the human race is doing as well as it is. Like when I hear people gripe about the government or their life, I always ask them, would you trade your life for your grandfather's life? Both my grandfathers 100 years ago were working small farms in the Midwest in houses that had no electricity or indoor plumbing. And they probably didn't have battery-powered radios yet. 100 years ago, Soviet Russia, Stalinist Russia, was starving millions of Ukrainians out of food because they had mismanaged their economy. Stalin didn't want to be seen as a loser, so they went and stole all the grain from the Ukrainians and caused a massive famine.
Yeah.
But most Americans don't know any history. But let's focus on the future. I know and love many young people under the age of 30, and they're going to be alive in 2050 and maybe even 2100. Mankind, we've added 5,000 million people to the planet since World War II ended. Think about that. That's 5 billion. We've never had that many people living on planet Earth, ever. So we got to figure out how we're going to build a future for 9 or 10 or 11 billion people that could be on the planet in the next 80 years or 100 years. But we never talk about it. We talk about the latest dumb thing that Donald Trump has said. And, Trump is a symptom of the real problem. And the real problem is both of our parties are in horrible shape. Let's face it. Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump. And there were a lot of reasons for it, not just the Russians. She wasn't a great candidate. Bill Clinton screwed America's working class, and a lot of us union guys know it. We do not like Bill Clinton. He was the worst Democratic president of the last 100 years, by far. And let's talk about the future, the screw-ups that have occurred, and how we're going to accommodate 10 billion people living on the planet. And also, my original point was, you always forget that human beings are very competitive. I played competitive sports. I understand the psyche of competitive people. And let's rethink all the wars we've just recently had and reframe them as human competitions. We had the Chinese communists fighting the Chinese nationalists, and that killed tens of millions of people for decades. And that's why we have a mess in Taiwan right now. The Nazis, 60 million people. Stalin, 100 million people. Mao Zedong, who knows? 100 million people. We've had some really horrible political activity go on, and we got some huge challenges in front of us, and I wish both of our parties would look at those challenges instead of falling into this ditch of day in, day out, scandal, squabble, who lied, who knows, who bribed who. That's been going on since the ancient Greeks.
So let me take that point. There's a bunch in there. There's a bunch in there, Brian. I'll stick with you for a second here. I think the point you just made, which was also your first point, there was a lot in there, and I'll at least get to that, maybe a little more. I actually think is really wise. I think what you had to say is, I'll cop to it. I think that our politics and our media, and certainly our Nattery Nabob radio media, of which I am an occasional grateful member, are too often prisoners of the moment. I think that's absolutely true, and that's what gets clicks. Of course, it tends to be what wins elections, but it's not what solves long-term problems. It might solve some, but some of the biggest long-term problems have to have solutions, at least systems built, so that they'll last for the long term. And we can even scale down your 100 years. If you're talking about 10 billion people, projection of 10 billion people, I think is closer to 25 years from now. And by 100 years, depending on if population growth continues to slow, and I think it is projected to slow from, like, we're supposed to get from 9 to 10 slower than from 8 to 9, at least according to current projections. But under most exponential growth models, you'd keep growing faster. Go look at a hockey stick curve, or even a more gradual curve of, let's say, the historic stock market or inflation, right? That tends to get faster. Right, that you get to 10 from 9 faster than you got from 8 to 9. But we might not speed up that much. But let me just ask this before we go to break. As you think about things we need to focus on in the long term, what's something you think we're missing?
How we're going to provide for that many people. Right now, we're just barely feeding everybody, just barely. And if there was some huge problem in the Middle East, or that war gets really bad in Ukraine, millions are going to starve.
Yep.
But we don't like talking about it.
All right. I want to get, before we go to break, because I got 30 seconds, I want to give one, because I just had, so my ex-stepsister, it's a long story, I may even tell it someday, is brilliant, and she is involved in regenerative agriculture. She's involved in, she says, listen, we talk a lot about carbon, and should we switch to an electric car? But the real challenge, the biggest greenhouse gas is water. The biggest greenhouse gas is water. We're not keeping enough water in the ground. And we're not keeping enough water on the ground because we're not planting enough. And that means in urban areas and suburban areas, each of us can plant a little bit. In our own gardens, we can make sure our cities are using open space to grow stuff, to actually make sure that we sort of rewild even some of our sort of human-occupied spaces. One of the biggest things we've got to do for resiliency and fighting the climate fight. So anyway, I'll put a plug in for regenerative agriculture.
Listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Thank you to Brian. Thanks to all of you. This is the Thom Hartmann Show. We'll be back with District Attorney Mike Schmidt. What's happening with the attack on progressive district attorneys?
Well, is Ezra Klein's new book, Why We're Polarized. This is from the introduction, and it's a couple pages into it. I'm starting out here. I have found that American politics is best understood by braiding two forms of knowledge that are often left separate: the direct on-the-ground insights shared by politicians, activists, government officials, and other subjects of my reporting, and the more systemic analyses conducted by political scientists, sociologists, historians, and others with the time, methods, and expertise to study American politics at scale. On their own, political actors often ignore the incentives shaping their decisions, and academic researchers miss the human motivations that drive political decision-making. Together, however, they shine bright light on how and why American politics works the way it does. There's much awry in American politics, and I won't in this book attempt to catalog all of it. But I've come to believe the master story, the one that drives almost all divides and most fundamentally shapes the behavior of participants, is the logic of polarization. That logic, put simply, is this: to appeal to a more polarized public, political institutions and political actors behave in more polarized ways. As political institutions and actors become more polarized, they further polarize the public. This sets off a feedback cycle. To appeal to a yet more polarized public, institutions must polarize further. When faced with yet more polarized institutions, the public polarizes further, and so on. Understanding that we exist in relationship with our political institutions, that they are changed by us and we are changed by them, is the key to this story. We don't just use politics for our own ends. Politics uses us for its own ends. There are many different types of polarization possible, and I'll discuss some of them later in the book, but the locus of polarization I'll discuss is on political identity. And that requires saying a few words about a term that should be very useful in American politics, but that has become almost useless: identity politics. A core argument of this book is that everyone engaged in American politics is engaged in identity politics. This is not an insult, and it's not controversial. We form and fold identities constantly, naturally. Identity is present in politics in the way gravity, evolution, or cognition is present in politics. That is to say, it is omnipresent in politics because it is omnipresent in us. There is no way to read the literature on how humans form and protect their personal and group identities, literature I will survey in this book, and believe that any of us is immune. It runs so deep in our psyches, so activated so easily by even weak cues and distant threats, that it is impossible to speak seriously about how we engage with one another without discussing how our identities shape that engagement. Unfortunately, the term identity politics has been weaponized. It is most often used by speakers to describe politics as practiced by members of historically marginalized groups. If you're black and you're worried about police brutality, that's identity politics. If you're a woman and you're worried about the male-female pay gap, that's identity politics. But if you're a rural gun owner decrying universal background checks as tyranny, or a billionaire CEO complaining that high tax rates demonize success, or a Christian insisting on nativity scenes in public squares, well, that's just good old-fashioned politics. With a quick sleight of hand, identity becomes something that only marginalized groups have. The term identity politics in this usage obscures rather than illuminates. It's used to diminish and discredit the concerns of weaker groups by making them look self-interested. Special pleading in order to clear the agenda for the concerns of stronger groups, which are framed as more rational, proper topics for normal political debate. But in wielding identity as a blade, we have lost it as a lens, blinding ourselves in a bid for political advantage. We're left searching in vain for what we refuse to allow ourselves to see. All politics is influenced by identity. Those identities are most powerful when they are so pervasive as to be either invisible or uncontroversial. American is an identity. So too is Christian. When politicians, including the irreligious, end speeches with "God bless America," it's not because they're making an appeal to a higher power, but because they're making an appeal to our bedrock identities. If you don't believe me, ask yourself why there are so few open atheists or even agnostics in national politics. This does not mean that politics is an equation solved by locating identity. Identity shapes our worldview, but it does not mechanistically decide it. And while we often speak of identity as a singular, it is always a dizzying plural. We have countless identities, some of them in active conflict with each other, others lying dormant until activated by threat or fortune. Much that happens in political campaigns is best understood as a struggle over which identities voters will inhabit come election day. Will they feel like workers exploited by their bosses, or heartlanders dismissed by coastal elites? Will they vote as patriotic traditionalists offended by NFL players who kneel during the national anthem, or as parents worried about the climate their children will inhabit? What we are often fighting over in American politics is group identity and status, fights that express themselves in debates over policy and power, but cannot be truly reconciled by either. Health policy is positive-sum, but identity conflict is zero-sum. The book Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein.
From international trade policy to immigration policy to housing, we've got all kinds of topics. The wars between Republicans and Democrats, the Republican efforts to induce fascism in the United States. A great selection of opinions will be found over at HartmannReport.com.
We are back. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. I am Jefferson Smith, and thanks for being with us. It is Fresh Start Monday. It's opening of the week. It is a chance to begin anew. Each day gives us a new sunrise and a new chance. What about people who need a new chance in their lives? What about people who have made important mistakes in their lives? I certainly have. What do we do about them or us? How do we deal with them in terms of community justice? How do we make sure we have a system of laws that builds accountability and at the same time doesn't shoot ourselves in our own foot or just act immorally? How do we make sure that our lens of justice is, in fact, not a lens of injustice? How do we move towards real justice? Who are the people doing that? How do you win an election as someone who is supposed to hold people accountable for crime if one of the things you also want to make sure is that there are opportunities for redemption? How does one build a political movement around that? How does one wield political power around that? How does one actually do that job? And who's for you and who's against you? What are some of the key issues? On the air right now, we have Mike Schmidt. Mike Schmidt is the district attorney of Portland, Oregon. It happens to be the one right near this studio. I should say Multnomah County, which is the county that surrounds and includes Portland, Oregon. It is not merely Portland, Oregon. He has become a national leader in how we think about a new kind of real justice. He can speak about that better than I can. We'll ask him questions, including the ways that district attorneys like him are right now under fire for doing the very thing they were elected to do. Mike, thanks for being with us.
Hey, thanks, Jefferson. Pleasure to be here.
So first, let's give some context. I said some words. When you describe yourself as a progressive district attorney, what does that mean?
Well, I think it means, first of all, that we're looking at the system of the criminal justice system that we have and recognizing there are things that we could do a lot better. We know that the United States is the most incarcerated nation in the world, and yet we're not the safest. So we know that we can actually achieve greater public safety and be better stewards of public resources and look at people as individual human beings to tailor our response to whatever decisions people make and criminality that occurs in our community.
So what's at stake? I mean, I know, and I think you even heard me say one night that what has typically happened, I know it happened over the history of Portland, is you had this sort of liberal city for at least some number of decades, that nonetheless, every time there was a new district attorney elected, and this is what happens in most counties, that district attorney is somebody who's handpicked by the previous district attorney, right? It's their lead deputy or somebody that sort of perpetuates that. Now, there in many organizations and many systems, that's good, right? It gives you a reward for sticking around, a reward for sort of rising up through the ranks. But if you're trying to fundamentally transform or even meaningfully transform an institution, that only having a baton passing that continues a set of practices not only for years or decades, but maybe even longer, is not necessarily a pathway to success. What's at stake for counties and cities that are trying to grapple with community justice in a way that's, I don't know, maybe less racist than it was blank number of decades or centuries ago?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. When I ran for this office in 2020, it marked essentially the very first contested election for district attorney that had taken place in almost 4 decades. So there was a lot at stake, and it was a healthy thing to have a contested election because I think for the first time there were debates between candidates for district attorney. I ran on a platform of addressing a lot of those things, disparity in our system, how much incarceration that we use, and also trying to think more holistically about how we achieve community safety in a way that the public and the community supports, and was overwhelmingly supported by this community when I won that election. And now we're at another phase where here we are 3 years later. I'm going to be standing for election here coming in the next year. And we've had a tough 3 years with the pandemic, social unrest. We've had a reckoning with civil rights in our criminal justice system. And at the same time, we've seen challenges across the country in major cities, especially, but also in urban locations of gun violence increasing. And so we're tackling those issues, working with community partners. But there's a lot at stake because there's a group, there's a voice that wants us to slide back to the way things have been for the previous 4 decades. And so those of us who are engaged in this fight are trying to, make sure that we keep with our values and hold the line, and also realize that safety and reform are not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand.
So as we think about, let's give us specific examples. We think about kind of what both as our consultant listeners and our policymaker listeners and our voting listeners and our activist and volunteer listeners, let's give examples of things that not only at stake, but even things that leaders can do from a community justice and sort of real justice perspective. Talk to us about resentencing initiatives. What are they? Why do they matter?
Yeah. So Oregon is one of, I believe, just 5 states right now that has recently changed its laws to enable district attorneys to reconsider cases of the past and bring them back into court for resentencing. That can be people who are currently in the system or people who have done their time and they're completely out of the criminal system. And as now we have this resentencing law on the books, we can bring people back in front of a judge and advocate that their sentence changes. We've used that authority so far to really look at a couple of different types of cases. Cases where maybe somebody was sentenced to an extremely long length of time for their conduct, rightfully convicted of the conduct, but the sentence is disproportionate with not only the peers maybe even at that time, but also as we think of how we're going to achieve justice today. So, for example, we had a case with a man who was charged with robbery for going into a bar, and he had a gun, didn't shoot at anybody, but was charged for every single person in the bar, and all those sentences were stacked consecutively to end up with a sentence that was in excess of 30 years. We look at similar conduct today, and we wouldn't see that type of a long sentence that was handed down in the mid to late 90s. So we reconsider that. Looking at cases where people are completely out of the system. When I was a young guy, there was a movie called Dick Tracy, and there used to be the whole, if you do the crime, you do the time. Well, that's a quaint idea because these days, when you do the crime, not only do you do the time, but that crime follows you around with a scarlet letter for the rest of your life. And so we've been able to take people who have served their time, they're completely out of the criminal system, but now they have that conviction that prevents them from accessing housing, that prevents them from going to chaperone their kids' events at a school because they have that felon label, even though they've been completely out of the system and crime-free. We can now bring those cases back, and we call those removing collateral consequences cases. We bring them back for resentencing, and where it's consistent with public safety, we can dismiss the underlying cases and give people a whole new lease on life.
Yeah, what comes to mind is everybody evaluates the world through their own eyeballs, but the dad of a dear friend of mine was a marijuana dealer. Right, he grew and sold marijuana back when in our state that was illegal, and it significantly impacted their life. Right, they made some money doing it, and then his house was seized and did have to go to prison. And I can imagine now there are people making a whole lot of money legally selling marijuana. So as norms change, as principles change, as laws change, if sentences and scarlet letters, to use your words, stick, that can feel probably stifling and keep people from getting a fresh start. What do you say to those folks who say, what a typical radio question that is. What do you say, District Attorney Mike Schmidt, what do you say to those who say, yeah, but how do we tough on crime? How do we make sure that there's sufficient deterrence from people doing bad? If we're doing all this nice, fluffy-hearted stuff.
Well, I actually think that re-examining the sentences of the past is good for public safety. It's smart on crime, and I'll tell you why. One, because when we are able to remove those barriers that are keeping people from going on and getting certain jobs. I worked with a young man who wanted to be an electrician and start his own electrician business. Well, he was prevented from bidding on prevailing wage jobs because of his felony conviction. By removing that felony conviction, he's now able to thrive, bid for more jobs. That means he's bringing money into his family, into his community. He's paying more taxes. He's doing exactly what we all claim we hope the criminal justice system achieves. So giving people, removing those barriers and getting them back on feet is good for public safety. And the other way that it's good for public safety is I believe it restores legitimacy in the system. And right now, I know I don't have to tell you or your listeners, there are a lot of institutions in our government that are experiencing crises of legitimacy. I think having the criminal justice system, having players like district attorneys being able to look back, acknowledge when we've made mistakes, correct those, or just acknowledge that maybe the things that we did in the past no longer serve the interests of public safety, it builds legitimacy in communities, and especially in communities that have a historical distrust of the criminal justice system. For example, the Black community. And so by looking at old convictions of the past that have especially disproportionately impacted those communities and removing those barriers, we can start to build trust. And that makes us more safe because when people trust the criminal justice system, they're more willing to participate. And that means that we can hold people who victimize other people accountable.
No, and maybe an obvious example, but if you're part of a community that has been victimized for decades, and let's say, remember the Black community, and they're not just low key, but high key racism that has been inflicted upon you, that the system of laws is not something that generationally for you, something you thought was sort of on your side, right? And then somebody's actually doing something bad 2 doors down from you, like genuinely bad. And somebody says, would you please tell us what's going on? And if you see something bad, report it and be a witness in the following case. You're like, wait, why am I supposed to be on your side, white boy? Why am I supposed to like report this when that dude a couple doors down might be on my side? You haven't been on my side ever. And by saying, no, we're all on the same side here, right? We're all just trying to figure out how we can get along, how we can make sure society works, how we can have a system of laws that roughly speaking we follow. That's what we're trying to do. And yeah, some people's job is to make sure we hold people accountable. You can be kind of on our side for that, will you tell us? And it gives us a much better chance of having truly safe communities rather than pockets of oppression that also can become pockets of villainy. And that's what I think we're after. I appreciate it. Now let's talk about, I'm going to call it the backlash. And I know it's not only happening, if it were only happening in Portland, it wouldn't be worthy of the show. But it's happening not just in Portland, but I appreciate you being willing to be witness to what's happening in other places around the country. And that is, and I'll use it with the illustration of what's happening in Portland. You can disabuse me of this or add more facts, is that literally the richest people in our state have funded literally the or close to the and tied for the most expensive political consultants in the state to target you well before the election, well before there was a candidate identified. Nobody was even running against you, and they're putting up billboards saying Portland is a Schmidt show. Ha ha, get it? Get it? It rhymes with a word I'm not supposed to say on the radio. Ha ha, get it? It's so clever. Anyway, Portland is a Schmidt show, doing an independent expenditure, dark money campaign to try to take you out of office even before, not with a set of solutions, right? Not with a better candidate, but just trying to tar and feather you. Correct me where I'm wrong or add facts. We got a little bit. We'll get to more of it after break. But that's not just happening in your or our neck of the woods, correct?
Oh, that's absolutely correct. And like you said, there are no solutions. In fact, when you look at, in my case, the billboard, they say things like empty jail beds. So I suppose the policy solution that they're looking for then is to fill the jail beds, which would apparently somehow magically create more safety. No, they don't have any solutions. They're trying to take us back. You know, Portland has real challenges, like we are hearing across the country with homelessness, with fentanyl hitting our streets, with overdose deaths, with addiction. And there's a group of people that I think are hoping that people in my position will just clean it up for them, just put folks in jail, just get them out of our sight. That's what they're trying to bring us back to. I talk to my fellow prosecutors across the country, and we're seeing the exact same thing in city after city, where the line is, oh, the DA doesn't prosecute that. They don't care about victims. They only care about this or that. And so, no, it's not unique to Portland. We've seen this roll out across the country. And it's really unfortunate because back to your earlier point about legitimacy, they think that they're attacking the district attorneys who are trying and who, by the way, are democratically elected by the communities that wanted them to change the way that we've traditionally done these things. But they think that they're attacking these individual political actors. But what they're really doing is they're delegitimizing the entire system, which actually leads to us being less safe.
So we're about to go to break, and I appreciate it. Where can people find out more, right? If you have this, and we saw it in the Trump campaign, right? We saw it, that he was multiple points behind and then started catching up a little bit based on this very often false narrative that liberals were endangering people. Right. And we're seeing this, and this ain't just about you. This ain't just about your race, right? This is a cynical ploy. Where can people find out more, either about your race or about some of the others?
Yeah, well, you really, unfortunately, have to do your homework because you see the kind of if it bleeds, it leads on the local news all too often, framing the issues of additional arrests, additional prosecution, filling jail beds gets us safety. There are a lot of good national outlets that are covering these things more thoughtfully. For us, you know, we're one of the most transparent.
We're going to break. We'll have to be right back. We'll be back with Mike Schmidt. This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff.
Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio, and tag you're it.
We're back. You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Show. We've got District Attorney Mike Schmidt with us. And Mike, just as we wrap and before we go to the break at the top of the hour, just wanted to ask, where can people find out more? What we heard you say was it's actually kind of hard. The media is not probably covering this as well as maybe they ought to. That I think probably for too long, I think your race is an example, that the question of how do we keep communities safe has been the ambit of too small a set of political actors. Too small a set of movements, too small a set. It's not even something. I mean, the elections tend to be nonpartisan, so political parties don't weigh in on it. You do end up getting Richard Nixon and Donald Trump trying to make hay on it to try to salvage what would otherwise be probably a relatively unpopular platform and pull out either close wins or end up losing nonetheless. And you said, well, you got to do your research and got to find out more. At least plug your own website, right? At least where can people find out about you?
So we have the District Attorney's Office website, dashboards. You can see the data for yourself, www.mcda.us. To find out more about me specifically, www.MikeSchmidtForDA.com.
Great. And any other towns, any other places that you think people should be aware of? And I'm aware of what's been happening in Minnesota. Any other places where you think there have been kind of these pro-real justice movements, right? These folks have been elected saying, yeah, let's do something about discriminatory justice practices and actually try to get to real safety. Where are some other places where people should be aware of, maybe?
Yeah, there are the ones that are really well known, like Philadelphia with DA Krasner, Chicago with DA State's Attorney Fox, or Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, obviously. One of the races that I've got my eye on that is on the same cycle as me is Monique Worrell in Orlando, Florida. The Florida district attorneys are very much under attack. They have a governor who himself is running for president and trying to politicize issues of crime as he saw that work out for the GOP. And so she is very much on the front lines of being under attack. Austin, Texas is another area that I've got my eye on. They're doing a lot of really fantastic work down in Austin. But one of the things that we've seen is us progressive prosecutors now represent over 20% of the population in the United States of America. So it is a growing movement. We keep winning races. That's why they're so threatened by this movement and trying to take us on city by city by passing and distributing misinformation.
No, I appreciate it. I'm reminded of, even in our town, there was this, that you were getting blamed, and how they got to that, if I thought the exercise were an exercise in truth discovery, I would be baffled. If I understood it as an exercise in propaganda, then it's no longer baffling. Try to blame you for a holdout husk of a building that was becoming a drug den. It was becoming an open-air fentanyl pit. And it's like, oh, look at this bad building. Here's Mike Schmidt. Meanwhile, you have a landowner who wasn't willing to prepare his space, wasn't willing to invest in safety precautions, was just waiting until he got a handout from the city, right, before he would do something. And these are the same folks who are then trying to fund, instead of having the fingers pointed at them as the people who actually own most of the land downtown. No. Blame the liberal. Blame that. Go get him. Go get that liberal. Don't look at us. Go get that liberal. So we appreciate you being that liberal and being on the show.
Hey, thanks so much, Jefferson. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. Be well. You're listening to Thom Hartmann Show. Let's go to your calls because you've been so very patient. Let's go to Ernie from Chicago. Go ahead, Ernie. We got a minute.
Yes, sir. I like this idea of when somebody gets out of prison that they'll be able to get a job. But what comes into play is that person has to be trusted. That person has to build up trust again by other people that he's interacting with. So counseling and monitoring for 5 years would be a good idea. That costs money. That's the big problem, not the idea of counseling and monitoring. What you do during the 5 years, it's intense in the beginning. And you slowly wean them off of your monitoring, your counseling, and then they're on their own. But again, the big thing is who's going to spend the money?
No, I appreciate it. Well, I don't know the good news. The bad news is prison's expensive. So if we think about how, and let's be clear, this should not be a binary analysis. This should not be a right versus left political power struggle merely or even primarily, right? This should be, how do we actually, what are the smartest things to do to have the best place we want to live, right? In the near term and in the long term. And how should community safety work? And and it's not about like being nice or mean. It's not that simple. Right? It's not being soft or hard. It's not that simple. But certainly, let's at least be smart, right? At least let's be thoughtful in how we do things and considered and strategic and work for shared objectives. And I love what you had to say. That make sure that somebody, when they are released, actually is put in a position to succeed, not by merely handouts, but by the way. What's the cost of somebody in prison? I should have asked Mike. Is it $50,000 a year?
Well, yeah, we know that. That's a lot of money. The other big question is community, and I hate to speak for communities because I haven't done a survey.
Sure.
But communities, I think on a whole, are very nervous when different types of, I'll use the word criminal, come back into society, whatever level they were at. And the only way that they're going to, get that community to feel safe is that the people that are in that community that were serving time and now are out.
Yep.
They have to know that they can trust those people. And how are those ex-prisoners going to build up?
No, I appreciate it, Ernie. And how do we, because real redemption isn't only about forgiveness of others. It's about the work of the person seeking redemption. I'm learning that myself, and I appreciate your time. We'll be back in just a little bit with your calls. We got Dennis and Carol and Mick and Dale and Deborah and Pearson and Paul. Thanks for your patience. Appreciate you here on Fresh Start Monday. Let's be smart about how we plan our cities. We'll be right back on your show. I'm Jeff.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We take life back!
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
Club is Ezra Klein's new book, Why We're Polarized. This is from the introduction, and it's a couple pages into it. I'm starting out here. I have found that American politics is best understood by braiding two forms of knowledge that are often left separate: the direct on-the-ground insights shared by politicians, activists, government officials, and other subjects of my reporting, and the more systemic analyses conducted by political scientists, sociologists, historians, and others with the time, methods, and expertise to study American politics at scale. On their own, political actors often ignore the incentives shaping their decisions, and academic researchers miss the human motivations that drive political decision-making. Together, however, they shine bright light on how and why American politics works the way it does. There's much awry in American politics, and I won't in this book attempt to catalog all of it. But I've come to believe the master story, the one that drives almost all divides and most fundamentally shapes the behavior of participants, is the logic of polarization. That logic, put simply, is this: to appeal to a more polarized public, political institutions and political actors behave in more polarized ways. As political institutions and actors become more polarized, they further polarize the public. This sets off a feedback cycle. To appeal to a yet more polarized public, institutions must polarize further. When faced with yet more polarized institutions, the public polarizes further, and so on. Understanding that we exist in relationship with our political institutions, that they are changed by us and we are changed by them, is the key to this story. We don't just use politics for our own ends. Politics uses us for its own ends. There are many different types of polarization possible, and I'll discuss some of them later in the book, but the locus of polarization I'll discuss is on political identity. And that requires saying a few words about a term that should be very useful in American politics, but that has become almost useless: identity politics. A core argument of this book is that everyone engaged in American politics is engaged in identity politics. This is not an insult, and it's not controversial. We form and fold identities constantly, naturally. Identity is present in politics in the way gravity, evolution, or cognition is present in politics. That is to say, it is omnipresent in politics because it is omnipresent in us. There is no way to read the literature on how humans form and protect their personal and group identities, literature I will survey in this book, and believe that any of us is immune. It runs so deep in our psyches, so activated so easily by even weak cues and distant threats, that it is impossible to speak seriously about how we engage with one another without discussing how our identities shape that engagement. Unfortunately, the term identity politics has been weaponized. It is most often used by speakers to describe politics as practiced by members of historically marginalized groups. If you're black and you're worried about police brutality, that's identity politics. If you're a woman and you're worried about the male-female pay gap, that's identity politics. But if you're a rural gun owner decrying universal background checks as tyranny, or a billionaire CEO complaining that high tax rates demonize success, or a Christian insisting on nativity scenes in public squares, well, that's just good old-fashioned politics. With a quick sleight of hand, identity becomes something that only marginalized groups have. The term identity politics in this usage obscures rather than illuminates. It's used to diminish and discredit the concerns of weaker groups by making them look self-interested. Special pleading in order to clear the agenda for the concerns of stronger groups, which are framed as more rational, proper topics for normal political debate. But in wielding identity as a blade, we have lost it as a lens, blinding ourselves in a bid for political advantage. We're left searching in vain for what we refuse to allow ourselves to see. All politics is influenced by identity. Those identities are most powerful when they are so pervasive as to be either invisible or uncontroversial. American is an identity. So too is Christian. When politicians, including the irreligious, end speeches with "God bless America," it's not because they're making an appeal to a higher power, but because they're making an appeal to our bedrock identities. If you don't believe me, ask yourself why there are so few open atheists or even agnostics in national politics. This does not mean that politics is an equation solved by locating identity. Identity shapes our worldview, but it does not mechanistically decide it. And while we often speak of identity as a singular, it is always a dizzying plural. We have countless identities, some of them in active conflict with each other, others lying dormant until activated by threat or fortune. Much that happens in political campaigns is best understood as a struggle over which identities voters will inhabit come election day. Will they feel like workers exploited by their bosses, or heartlanders dismissed by coastal elites? Will they vote as patriotic traditionalists offended by NFL players who kneel during the national anthem, or as parents worried about the climate their children will inhabit? What we are often fighting over in American politics is group identity and status. Fights that express themselves in debates over policy and power, but cannot be truly reconciled by either. Health policy is positive sum, but identity conflict is zero sum. The book, Why We're Polarized, by Ezra Klein.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I'm Jeff Smith. This is the Thom Hartmann Program. The call-in number here is 202-808-9925, 202-808-9925. Icarus is the theme of the day, but our risk is not merely hubris, and it's not merely the wisdom of the patriarchy. But if we think of the example of OceanGate, I didn't say Watergate, it was in fact the voice of youth that kept some people safe. And it was the experience and greed and hubris of the experienced wealthy owner who drove people literally to their deaths. Not by flying too high, but by sinking too low. Let's get to your phone call. You've been waiting so patiently. Pearson from Lamarck, Texas, you win the most patient listener award.
I will agree with you. I do. I have. And you are still America's *1 substitute teacher.
Thanks, Pearson.
Anyway, to dovetail with some of your listeners might remember Larry. I think Larry was his name. At the bottom of your first hour, your first half hour of the show, he made a comment about how Republicans, conservatives, whatever you want to call them, that they like to own people and all this stuff. And I would say, to back that up, they cost us money at every turn. They're grossly inefficient on purpose. They don't have plans for anything, like that Larry caller mentioned. They rush into things with no plans, and there's several recent historical examples of this, which is extremely worrying and aggravating. George Bush and Dick Cheney, they took this military of ours into Iraq with no plans as to what they would do after they got established there. And to add insult to injury, in addition to removing from the planet 2 million innocent Iraqis, they supposedly lost $12 billion, as in $1 billion of cash that were shrink-wrapped, put on a pallet, and sent to an unsecured building. And you know where that money went. It went into the wrong hands. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of Republicans had their hands out, and they got a taste of that. They wetted their beak on the back of the American people. They cost us money at every turn. They have no plans once they arrive at a country with American military, killing people and breaking things, and they have no plan how to get out. And then they want to criticize Joe Biden for pulling us out.
Yeah, no, the Earl Blumenauer, member of Congress, had a line that I'll get a little bit wrong, but his line was, they seem to try to build power, try to gain power with the argument the government can't work. And when they get power, they try to prove it. Examples.
Here's another thing unrelated. When you were talking about North Miami Beach has no beach.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, when my family moved from New York to Houston, my uncle lived on West Mount Houston Road in northwest Harris County, northwest Houston, Texas. Yeah. And guess what? No mountains anywhere. No mountains on West Mount Houston Road. And I think they do that sometimes to hide the fact that everything is flat.
Right.
So
well, I'll give you one. Mostly off topic, but thank you so much, Pearson, for the phone call. That if you drive down I-5, which is for those who are not West Coasters, is the interstate highway that goes down not alongside the Pacific Ocean, but in the same general direction, right? It's the West Coast Highway. And if you're going from Portland to Ashland, which you might do if you're going to go to, let's say, the nation's best Shakespeare Festival, okay? We're in Portland, Ashland, about a 6-hour drive. Halfway is a place called Rice Hill. You can get ice cream there. It's a good place to get ice cream. And if you're a 9-year-old kid being driven to a Shakespeare play who's got hyperactivity, you appreciate very much the pause for ice cream. Post ice cream, not everybody else in the car appreciates it, but you, as the eater of the ice cream, appreciate it very much. When you're driving down, you pull over to Rice Hill and you go down to a little valley. All right. And if you go a little further, you see a place called Rice Valley on the top of a little hill. Now, nobody's ever been able to explain to me, but I think it's got to be right-wing propaganda. It probably isn't. It's just somebody did something weird, and I don't know why. Let's keep going with your calls. Let's go to Dale from Pensacola, Florida. Hello, Dale.
Hey, Jefferson. Thanks for taking my call. I'll be brief. Spent the weekend in rural North Carolina, and when the attempted coup came up, I brought that subject up to my conservative North Carolina relatives. And then, well, why are we sticking our nose in somebody else's business? And I reflected on that, like, conservatives worrying about us sticking our nose in somebody else's business. And I gave them a brief history of Saddam Hussein in Kuwait, the Vietnam War, Panama. When, is my question to you, when did the conservatives, both Democratic in the 60s and Republicans in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now, stop being concerned about the advancement of democracy in the world and us keeping our nose out of other people's business?
It's a good question.
I'll take your answer off.
I appreciate that, Dale. It's a good question. And it's a question that I continue to wrestle with. Might even be worth a full segment. So this transition of the conservative movement from, like, let's call it a McCain party to a Trump party. And I don't mean that in all the ways. I particularly mean that with respect to application of international force. Because they're actually not trying to reduce military expenditures and save money, but they do have this fixation on not interfering with Vladimir Putin, which is weird. So a few thoughts. One is, I do think there's a thing with as some baby boomers have aged and become sort of Fox News viewers, that there is some purchase, you can sort of maintain kind of an international relations consistency with a small sector. But I think that's a smaller part. Some of it I worry, and I speculate, but some of it I genuinely worry is that, well, with Russia, it seems relatively clear that when it was the Soviets and you didn't have American industrialists who had financial relationships, it was an easy opponent. Now, you have so many lawyers, you have so many law firms, accounting firms, so many hedge funds and private equity firms that are tied up with Russian oligarchic money, that now there is, even setting aside kind of secret stuff, even just stuff out in the open, it's a lot harder to just go after him. That the essence of the thing maybe never was John McCain's patriotism. Maybe the essence of the thing always was greed. Maybe the essence of the thing always was plutocracy and oligarchy. And where oligarchy is benefited by, a banana rebellion, when oligarchy is benefited through the invasion of a place to have greater control over its natural resources, call it oil or whatever, then the oligarchs kind of like it. But if you're flexing international power to defend democracy, if you're flexing international power without an obvious benefit to profiteers, well, the profiteers don't like that as much. And if you're interfering with their profit making, they really don't like it. So I'm not prepared to say that's the full answer, but that's the part of the best I've been able to come up with. And then the other, frankly, is there has absolutely been an infiltration within the Republican Party of folks, and we saw what happened with the NRA, right? It's like, it's kind of easy to manipulate the Republican Party these days. All you got to do is build common cause to hate the left, to own the libs. As soon as you do that, it's one of the reasons why that current movement can't be trusted, is because it's too easy to manipulate. You don't have to say, well, we agree with you on the following policies. You named one of the best. Like, at what point was the Republican Party the ally of Russia? Right now, there are still a bunch of Republicans who don't want to be the ally of Russia. Even Lindsey Graham is struggling over not wanting to be an ally of Russia. So how do you sort of navigate that? But it's too easy to infiltrate the modern Republican Party because all you got to do is say, no, we all hate the left. We all hate the left, so you're on our side. And then all of a sudden, you can show up at the platform meeting and you can start softening the position. You can be Paul Manafort. You can actually change the position in the Republican platform relative to Russia. So some of it has been actual specific manipulation as well. That's what I got. Let's hear what you got right after the break.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program. Speed round coming up, 202-808-9925. We're on with Carol. Hey, Carol, how are you?
I'm good. It's great to see you. Good show.
Thank you. It's good to hear from you.
Thank you. You mentioned Icarus descending, which is in Ovid's Metamorphosis. One of the things that people don't seem to take notice of very often anymore is one of the main themes of that story, and it is the limitations that our planet puts on us and our environment. And, for example, you said recently, I heard someone say recently that North Miami Beach does not have a beach.
Yeah.
Well, I think that could easily change because we are ignoring the limitations of our planet.
Yeah.
Now, Icarus ignored them by flying too close to the sun, and his wings melted. And I think people don't realize that it was Daedalus, his father, who actually had him build those wings because he was in prison, and he thought that his son Icarus could fly him out of prison on those wings, and he warned his son Icarus, don't get too close to the sun or your wings will melt and you will fall into the sea. And that's just what happened. And I think if we ignore the limitations our planet is putting on us right now, which is we are willing to continue making fossil fuels prevalent in our environment, etc., and if we don't stop, we're going to have a very hot planet. And in other words, I think we may fly too close to the sun.
No, well put, Carol. Bravo, and thank you. And literally almost literally bringing the sun too close to us, right? Like literally melting our wings, not only metaphorically. And I appreciate that connection. That's brilliant. And and how can we prevent the hubris of humanity from eating ourselves? And citing another caller earlier, how do we make sure we're not just prisoners of the moment, but actually think 25, 50, and 100 years out and realize what do we have to do for community resiliency, what trees we have to plant below which we may never enjoy the shade, but they will be there for a future generation, and how do we make sure that the tug and pull of political power don't keep us from a longer view and keep us towards sort of actually solving problems. No, I like it. And I'd forgotten, and I'd certainly neglected to mention that when Daedalus was giving Icarus the charge, that he was doing it from prison. So it has been a story as told to me to sort of support patriarchal wisdom. But it wasn't merely that. And what I find so poetic, what I find so Greek in the story of Titanic and of OceanGate, I didn't say Watergate, is this reversal. This reversal not only of generation, not only of geography, but also of generation. Carol, thank you so much for being a loyal listener to this show. Appreciate it so much. All right, and we'll be right back on the Thom Hartmann Show. The call-in number is 202-808-9925. Speed round coming up.
Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com.
We're on Speed Round. This is Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Jeff Smith. Let's go to Paul from, I believe it's Ambler, Pennsylvania.
Hi, Jefferson. It is Ambler. I wanted to talk about productivity in relation to demographics. You were talking earlier about the boomers being the largest generation, and eventually they pretty much knew decades ago that as we retired, there wouldn't be enough people to replace us, and there would be a lot of dislocation. But at the same time, they were also providing us with technological advancements in productivity so that we were producing more and more with fewer people, and that we would have a great deal of leisure time. Back in 1899, the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the U.S. government predicted that we would have to move to an 8-hour day because there was simply not enough work that was needed to be done because of the advancements of steam engines, the railroads, the telegraph. We were exploding in the Industrial Revolution, and we were exploding in productivity. We were simply getting more done than we ever could before with the same amount of people. They just didn't need to work as much. And the proof is we've gone from the 6-day week and the 12-hour day to the 5-day week and the 40-hour week and the 5-day work week. Now, we all went through this whole terrible, I call it the pandemonium pandemic. Most people had to stay at home, but the economy still worked. You know, we had electricity, we had water, we had heat in the winter, we had air conditioning in the summer. We had, other than the so-called supply chain issues, everything pretty much operated even though people were sitting at home. And the reason is we could operate a lot of businesses from home, or the businesses were being operated with a very small amount of people due to automation, computers, and many of the things that we're aware of already, the internet, and of course, the famous robot factories. What we're looking at now, again, is another political decision that has to be made. But the great conflict in the world today is between economics and politics. The capitalists, the neoliberals, they think everything should be decided by the market, which is what? Artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
The best competitive organizations to produce the best product for the best price should prevail. Well, where's the decision making in that? There's some sort of invisible hand guiding us. Well, that's ridiculous. It's not politics. Politics are people confronting one another and saying, this is what I want, and this is how much of I want of it. What people want now is to work less because we realize we don't have to. Less than 2% of the population farms all the food. Less than 8% manufactures all the goods that we need.
Yep.
What are the other 90% doing most of the time? Well, what we could be doing is not working, but not working for somebody else to get rich. I am so-called retired, but I'm busy. I'm not busy making a profit for Elon Musk so he can ride in a space rocket, or some other dope who wants to go in a submarine and look at a grisly remains of a sunken ship. I'm working for my granddaughter who needs help with her math, or I'm working with my other children and I related to my banking information so that they can buy homes and become homeowners. I'm working in the informal economy. I'm not worried about a profit. I'm worried about improving the quality of life of the people around us.
So go ahead, finish your point.
Informal economy where people don't get paid, and we have the economy where you must work for other people who will give you money so you can survive.
Yeah.
And that's what's going on now. Politics versus economics. And right now, with all the advanced technology, we don't need economics.
Yeah.
We need more politics.
I appreciate it, Paul. Thanks for the call. There's a bunch in there. Let me say a couple things. So there's always more work to be done, right? Parkinson's law is the idea that work will expand to fill the time allowed. But you're also right that the people who've been pushing for universal basic income, that a significant part of the argument is that with enhanced automation, less is needed for some basic needs. But there's still, people want to do stuff. The idea that, if you don't make people be productive at the point of the gun, they won't do anything, I think is overstated, right? I think incentives work, and I think that people do stuff. We don't only stay in front of the television or stay doom scrolling on our favorite or least favorite app that we're addicted to on our telephone. So it's not even a telephone anymore, right? Telephone's probably an old word. And now we do have to figure out how we are going to fundamentally transform I guess I'll use your terms, how do we fundamentally transform our politics to catch up to the fact that our economics have already been and are being fundamentally transformed, that economic reality is fundamentally transformed. So how do you make sure that we aren't just controlled by money and robots, but that humanity and purpose still is in charge, still plays a meaningful role? And I think it's one of those long-term topics we got to keep at. But it's supposed to be speed round, and I've been violating that. So I'm going to go to Mick, who's got an idea for the future. Mick, you're on speed round.
Well, thanks for taking my call, Jefferson. I wanted to comment on an earlier caller who brought up the fact that we need to talk about brainstorming the future.
Yep, give us a quick one. She's about to put us to break.
Okay, well, one of them is Dr. Wolf's suggestion about worker cooperatives. I think we need to get away from the unions and start thinking about worker cooperatives. That's just one of many ideas that I follow because of Ben Franklin, who's a model American.
Mick, thank you for the phone call, and what a perfect follow-on to the previous discussion. As we move forward, the idea of just working for Elon Musk, it doesn't make that much sense. And you don't just have to work for your granddaughter, but you can band together with folks, solve the problem together, and each get a cut of the deal, right? Rather than just somebody else getting the whole deal.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We are on Speed Round 202-808-9925. I'm Jeff. This is your show.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Today's book in our book club is The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, by this guy, Thom Hartmann. This is from chapter 1, or from the introduction, actually. In 2016, 6% of Americans who were eligible to vote nominated Donald Trump as the GOP's presidential candidate. It was 8% for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. Trump went on to be elected president by 26% of eligible voters. The modern American oligarchs have largely stayed in power using three simple elements: explicit and overt racism, massive disinformation campaigns, and voter suppression. No ideas, no push for better schools, hospitals, airports, roads, or bridges, or reform of our health, energy, or financial systems. No promise of more and better jobs. None of these staples of past presidential campaigns can be found in pretty much any Republican advertising today. Instead, the public Republican message is all about race, or the subset of race, religion. Muslim stands in for brown Arab in GOP speak, and immigration, aka brown people from south of our border, and socialism. Meanwhile, Republican secretaries of state across the nation are vigorously purging voters from the rolls. Over 17 million, more than 10% of America's active voters, in just the 2016-2018 period, according to NBC News. After the after the 5 Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, 14 GOP-controlled states moved within a year, some within days, to restrict access to the vote, particularly for communities of color, students, and retired people. In North Carolina, for example, 158 polling places were permanently closed in the 40 counties with the most African American voters just before the 2016 election, leading to a 16% decline in African American early voting in that state. An MIT study found that nationwide, Hispanic voters wait 150% longer in line than white voters, and black voters can expect to wait 200% longer in line to vote. In Indiana, then Governor Mike Pence's new rigorous voter ID law caused an 11.5% drop in African American voting. Students are suing for their right to vote, and retired people who no longer drive but care passionately about their Social Security and Medicare are being turned away at the polls by the hundreds of thousands because their driver's licenses have expired. The obvious failure of 40-plus years of Reaganomics and GOP policies to maintain a functional middle class in America has been a problem for the modern GOP. In 1974, for example, the GOP had outright control of only 7 states. The message, elect us and we'll help the rich people, just didn't generally resonate with American voters. It's the reason why, outside of the fluke elections of 46 and 52, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives outright for 3 generations, from 1933 to 1996, and controlled the Senate for most of that time. Desperate to win the presidency for the GOP in 1968, Richard Nixon went so far as to commit treason by torpedoing a peace deal with President Lyndon Johnson that President Lyndon Johnson had worked out with the North and South Vietnamese. According to Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, then president of Iran, Ronald Reagan did the same thing by cutting a deal with Iran whereby they would hold on to the U.S. embassy hostages until after the 1980 presidential election, torpedoing Jimmy Carter's chances of re-election. But in 2000, the GOP changed tactics. After Reagan was almost busted for his part in Iran-Contra, he testified that he had forgotten about details of the program more than 80 times. His growing Alzheimer's spared him an indictment. They realized that getting busted for treason wasn't worth the risk. They needed a plan B, and it was deliciously simple. If most voters don't like what you're selling, then just don't let them vote. Paul Weyrich promoted this idea back in 1980 when he was campaigning for Reagan after co-founding the Heritage Foundation. And indeed, many Republican luminaries, such as William Rehnquist, who went from serving the GOP by standing in polling places and intimidating Hispanic and Native American voters in the 1960s, to becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rose up through the ranks by participating in Republican-run voter intimidation schemes. Voter suppression became the foundational go-to tactic for the GOP in 2000. Although the GOP attacked Democratic presidential nominee Al Gore with smear and innuendo, ridiculing him for helping write the legislation that created the modern internet, for example, the main thing that got George W. Bush into the White House was voter suppression. His brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush, and Bush's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, threw somewhere between 20,000 and 90,000 African-American voters off the rolls. They were able to get the vote close enough that 5 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court functionally awarded Bush the presidency. The BBC covered this in 2001 in 2 major investigative reports that were seen all over the world, except on any American media. By 2016, the Republican Party had fine-tuned its voter suppression and intimidation systems to the point that they ran like well-oiled machines in nearly 30 states. Between the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, for example, Ohio had purged more than 2 million voters from its rolls, the vast majority, more than 2 to 1, in heavily African-American and Hispanic counties. The 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that they could keep it up. And other states have since adopted their new tactic of caging voters. The book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, by me.
From international trade policy to immigration policy to housing, we've got all kinds of topics. The wars between Republicans and Democrats, the Republican efforts to induce fascism in the United States. A great selection of opinions will be found over at HartmannReport.com.
It is summer, but at this point of the program, it is time for the harvest. It's time to harvest the wisdom of this community. A community that keeps us humble as well as smarter. Hopefully, not only humble, but even more audacious to solve the challenges, or at least analyze, embrace, address, nibble at the challenges that face us all together. And by all of that, I mean it is time for the speed round. Dennis from Crystal River, Florida, you are on the air.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I have one question.
why in God's green earth are we allowing China to buy property in the United States all over the United States?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think it's because the people who own the property would like to sell it, make a lot of money from that. Now, why that is in the United States' interest is a good question. I won't get into the entirety of navigating the relationship with China, and I don't even have to do much to cite Kissinger and sort of the modern manifestation of what's happening with Russia and China trying to be more softly aligned to weaken the United States, and those who are trying to damage our relationships with China even further to aid Putin in that triangulation, and recognizing that China is the greatest emerging power, certainly, I guess, now second largest population in India, and with an even more vast growing economy and a stronger nuclear power. It's why there hasn't been, I need to get a diplomat to know why there hasn't been a move to say, okay, cut that off. Right? Why there hasn't been a significant tariff. So I'll have to leave it with that. Sometimes the question has to linger. Otherwise, I'll violate. Speed round, James, Hollywood, California.
Jefferson, my friend, I first want to give you a gift on behalf of all the graduates of Thom Hartmann University. I'm going to give you a new middle name.
All right.
And your new middle name shall be Word. So you shall be known as Jefferson Wordsmith.
Oh. Thank you very much. I'll take it. That's I was where gifts could go a lot of different directions, right? I'll take that one. Thanks, James, for calling.
Well, Jefferson, I had more.
Please, no, I was waiting for it.
Oh, well, yes. You being an attorney, I was at Tom's book launching of a book that was just read from by Thom Hartmann on the Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back.
Yep.
And do you have any suggestions? Because I want to throw one out to all
the
voters in California. I want to get rid of all 12 Republican congressmen in California, and the law here is you only need to register where you move to for 30 days. So if we can get rid of all 12 Republicans in California, because we can't do anything with the red states, let's get rid of all 12 Republican U.S. congressmen in California, and it can be done. And I got a game plan to do it. But
where can people find the game plan?
I'm a dinosaur, my friend. I talk on the telephone. I write with.
And you call on the radio, which we prefer, which we appreciate.
Yes, and I've been called the greatest poet of the 21st century. And there's a quick little one that you appreciated. I believe. I think I am timeless. Yet is that not thoughtless? Time ends when love begins. Only love lives on forever.
Oh, James, wonderful. Let's have that be your last word. Let's go to Gar. Appreciate it, James. Let's go to Gar from Atlanta, Georgia.
All right, Jefferson, speed round. First thing I like to say is that we have to watch our back. United States is in Russia, but we got to understand the Soviet Union broke up into 14 states after they came out of Afghanistan after 10 years. We was in Afghanistan for 20 years, and we have people talking about divorce. The United States should divorce. So we have to watch our back. And that's what I have to say. Because,
and when you say divorce, you mean like the Marjorie Taylor Greene thing of saying we got to separate and go back to and go back to Jefferson Davis's proposal of a segregated and divided, legitimately or illegitimately divided America.
Right, and the Soviet Union is now what? Russia and Ukraine. California would be our Ukraine.
Yep.
And so we have to watch our back. I mean, because history is staring us in the face and say, this is what happened when you do this. are we looking at it? We got the roadmap. We got the end game of what happens.
Yep. I appreciate it, Gar. Thank you for the call. And I'm reminded that the information very recently that Germany just published its first since World War II, or maybe its first ever. I think they didn't even have one before World War II. Their first ever national defense strategy, overall national defense strategy that 80 years after, a little better than 80 years after World War II, that we're now forgetting lessons of history in Germany, saying, okay, well, we can have a national security plan now, provoked, of course, by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Deborah, you win Most Patient Listener Award in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Thank you, Jefferson. I love you so much.
Oh, it's okay.
I'm going to be real quick, and I think what I have to share may actually synthesize what all your other callers have been saying, moving into the future, et cetera.
Yep.
I want to urge you and Tom and all the listeners to go onto YouTube and watch a free 3-hour video of Dr. Stephen Greer's press conference for the National Press Club, June 12th of this year. And it will blow the lid off everything that we've been talking about and move us at hypersonic speed into the world that we want. He's spent 30 years documenting two prongs. What happened with Eisenhower's warning against the military-industrial complex, and specifically all the sequestered and yet developed technology from the ET crash at Roswell. Okay, all of that has been reverse engineered and is part of deeply buried black ops, and also simultaneously the ruthless suppression of free energy technology that was already happening, in the 20s with Nikola Tesla, et cetera, quantum vacuum energy, 0 point, or so-called just free energy. All of these technologies have been developed, are being used by a synthesis of corporate and black ops military. Stephen Greer has collected over 30 years testimony, the whistleblowers by the thousands who have worked in these black programs and are coming forward by the droves. He has just dropped on Congress and the president 8 terabytes of documentation of the illegal sequestering and suppression and refusal to give it in the interest of
I love
oil.
that stuff. It's fascinating. So Dr. Stephen Greer, I can't vouch for it, haven't seen it. We'll check it out. I do think there is a meaningful risk that, and we've seen it over and over again, a meaningful risk of suppression of technology for the benefit of sort of power structure, the benefit of the people who own it. I can't speak to the stuff in Roswell, although my wife is into it and fascinated. In fact, my wife was a big
YouTube, Dr. Stephen with this Steven Greer, Greer. It's free. Go to YouTube. And he just came out with a new film called The Lost Century and How to Retrieve It. Okay,
good plug,
please,
Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the call. We're on speed round. We'll go to you, Howard.
Yeah, hi. I think the biggest problem in America by far is that people have no source to understand what's true, what's a lie, what's fact, what's fiction. So I put in a proposition to my congressman, and so far he's okay, but I requested $15,000 to finish up the research. But I'm going to knock your socks off for a minute with some numbers you're not going to believe. I have 30 years of experience. So I said to people, first, is there anybody you trust in news guy, radio, TV? 80% said there's no one. Then if they were over, I had 100 people. Then I said, if they're over 40, how about Walter Cronkite? 99% said they would turn on TV if Walter Cronkite was still doing the news. I said Abraham Lincoln, under 20%. George Washington, under 20%. Albert Einstein, 99%.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I said, okay, what I want to do is make artificial intelligence videos doing the news of those two guys. Just under 40%, 39% said they would watch artificial intelligence video versions and they would trust it and they would believe it.
AI Cronkite and AI Einstein. You get to something, how do we get? People will seek truth if we can give it to them. And I appreciate that reminder, whether or not we get AI Cronkite, but I like the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
This is the Thom Hartmann Show. We'll be back with Big Big Finish, and your calls 202-808-9925. Susan in Saratoga Springs, you are on the air.
Hey, Jefferson. Great calls today.
Yeah.
Fabulous listeners today. What
I agree.
a great day. Yeah, so I'm calling kind of to chime about the gentleman who shared about being doing services that are non-paid for as we retire.
Yep.
And I do that myself because I had to leave full-time work in my early 50s because I'm a caregiver for a 34-year-old autistic son. And and he's in he has a lot of health issues, whatever, low IQ, but he's wonderful. He's like Forrest Gump of Saratoga Springs, New York. He's the most popular guy. So what I did in that time is I started to get, because we're living in an apartment complex, mentoring some of these young people. And I've seen great changes, but that's what I do. I mentor young people. They come over, I give them advice, because a lot of these young broken homes, a guy across the hall from me, he's drinking all the time, finance major, just working in a restaurant and boozing. And he lost his job. I drive him to take a course, and now he's been an accountant for 5 years.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you. And second of all, there is a policy lesson in there. And and not only finding purpose, finding relationship, which are the things that drive lifespan, right? Like ask any gerontologist, ask anybody who studies the success of people as they age. And it's my birthday on Thursday, and I'm getting older. I guess all of us are getting older every day.
Happy birthday.
Thank you very much. And and so it's on my mind a little bit. And my dad's gotten sick, and so this stuff's on my mind. And so when you read that stuff, you learn that what prolongs life, what beyond sort of basic heart and basic cancer problem, basic health problems, what prolongs life is when people have purpose and relationships, those two things. When they have something to do during the day that fills them up, and not just in terms of food and water, and when they have people in their lives that they care about and who care about them. That those are the big drivers. And so I want to share that, sort of amplify that part, shout out and say thank you for that part of the lesson. But the other thing is we know that multi-generational living, we know that when there are young people who have in their lives older people, not just their parents, they can include their grandparents, but people who are even more than one generation separated from them, that it genuinely has huge benefits for the development of young people and for older people. And so appreciate that. I hope other people, Susan, will follow your example.
It's a great life this way. This is the way to retire.
There you go.
It's very fulfilling. Really is. Give back, because those young people are going to save the earth.
No, I want to dwell on it.
I can't do a lot now. But.
It's supposed to be speed round, but I got to dwell on it. Your example, like please heed what Susan is saying, right? Like this show is listened to in a lot of ways, including a lot of sort of high technological ways. At its root, it is a radio show, or certainly was at its root a radio show, right? And radio is it's something I genuinely love, right? Is an art form. It is a communication mechanism, technology that I respect. Not every radio listener is under the age of 25. Okay. So to our older listeners, as you're thinking about how you're spending your days, that finding a pathway to do as Susan is doing, not only saying, but as Susan is doing.
Oh, it's so refreshing.
Oh,
I mean,
man.
they have parents. I have them over for Christmas. It's wonderful. It's just a wonderful life, and they keep me young, boy. They do keep me young, and they're getting better. They're getting better.
Well, thanks for watching us on YouTube. Thanks to all the people on Free Speech TV. We'll be right back. The Thom Hartmann Show and the Big Big Finish.
Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us.
We are on speed round getting to your calls, and we appreciate them. And I agree with our previous listener and caller. Wonderful calls today. You're all a bunch of poets and scholars. Appreciate you very much. An honor to be among you. Let's go to Donald from, is it Jensen Beach, Florida? I appreciate the Florida calls. Go ahead.
Well, okay. I can't believe I'm on live. Anyway, I watch the show and I sometimes contribute. I'm retired. I used to be an attorney. So what I called to talk about, maybe.
What kind of law? What kind of law, if you don't mind me asking?
I was a litigator.
Very good.
Federal and state courts, jury trial, civil, not criminal. I actually did spend an internship with the Justice Department.
Oh, very good. Thank you.
And I was pretty good.
Yep.
I had a case against Elena Kagan and David Kendall on defamation.
Oh, really?
Yes. But my career came to an end with my first marriage. But that's not what I'm calling. Okay. So, Clarence Thomas, okay? Nobody seems to be able to touch this guy. But you know what? He's a member of a bar association, the Missouri Bar. Somebody, maybe the Justice Department, since they're a litigant in cases before the court, ought to file a complaint, an ethics complaint. Why not? He's still a member of the bar.
Yeah.
And if they ask him to respond, if he doesn't, then he can lose his license. So there he's got to come forward and come clean about everything.
Yeah.
Listen, they got Al Capone on tax stuff, right? Why not? I bet you don't. I don't know if you know this, but you can be on the Supreme Court and not even be a member of the bar, having gone to law school. There's a rule in the Supreme Court, I think. I think it's still there. It's very strange. But anyway, it's a way. I mean, the Senate seems hamstrung. They should change the rules. It's very unethical. But it's a way.
It's an interesting idea, Donald. If the Supreme Court is not going to police itself, if they're not going to have sort of internal accountability mechanisms, there are accountability mechanisms for anybody who's a member of the bar, and you named a key one. So I appreciate the idea. And someday I would love to hear the Elena Kagan story.
It was early in her career. I think she was working for Williams and Connolly or something, but a long time ago. You call me back. I got plenty of funny stories, not just them. A lot of the lawyers in D.C. I used to practice. I had one case. In that case, her client was the CSICOP, the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. It was also against James the Amending Randy, a magician.
Fascinating. Oh, that is fantastic. This is fantastic.
I'm going to ask you one more thing, because I understand you're a lawyer. Okay.
Mostly recovered, but yeah.
Yeah. I haven't practiced in 30 years. I went into investment banking and management. I was a broker and advisor. Right?
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to ask you this opinion. So the Dobbs case, okay? Basically, in my opinion, they said, okay, if it isn't in the Constitution, strict construction. Can't have abortion. They had to do away with the law.
Yep.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't written in the Constitution.
Yep.
So I know that Thom Hartmann is big on this about corporate rights under the Bill of Rights.
Yep.
Okay. Well, under Dobbs, why aren't we taking back all those rights? Because there's nothing in the Constitution.
No, the corporate form is not protected in the Constitution. But
they still got the application of the Bill of Rights, which shouldn't be back during the Civil War with the railroads.
Yeah.
No, it was all a farce.
No, you're right. And
I know the story. It was in a head note in the Supreme Court, and then they adopted it. It's complete nonsense.
And any longtime listener of Hartmann has heard him tell the story. It was dicta, and they used the dicta.
I know. So why not now under Dobbs, somebody bring back those cases and say it's not in the Constitution?
No, they should, but you know the answer. But genuine, if you're on Twitter, I really would love to follow up. Tweet me I'm at Jefferson D. Smith on Twitter, or you can ping the show, because I would actually love to follow up.
I'm not a big social media guy.
That's fine. It's fine. But I'll give you the.
I'm an analog guy in the digital world.
No,
but
Don,
70 years old. So.
I appreciate the call. We know the answer, and thanks so much for the call. We know the answer, and that is of why they're not taking that idea up is because Alito doesn't care about judicial consistency, jurisprudential consistency, and we know from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. that what a judge will do is all I mean by law. So, Barbara, we got about 30 seconds for you. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm from Buffalo, New York originally, and I wanted to relate a personal story that relates to what's going on, I think, currently in our political atmosphere. My dad was a judge in our local town, and he was elected for 20 years. He was elected repeatedly, and he decided about 1980 that he wanted to go for county judge.
Yep.
And he met with the Republican Party heads, and he was told that sure he could get the endorsement of the party as long as he forked over $100,000.
Wow!
Now
Just
we
pay
had
for
5
play.
kids in our family. We were all going to college. Dad was a lawyer. That was mainly his income, and he had his own practice with 2 associates. He was not making a killing. He didn't have $100,000
lying around
for anything, much less to give to them.
Wow. Well, I would.
And I've never seen. Go ahead, please.
No. Finish your thought. I want to get to our last caller because we got about 45 seconds left in the show.
You got it. I just wanted to say I had never seen my World War II vet father cry, and he was the chief engineer on a minesweeper in the Pacific Theater. But the fact that he had to deal with that bullshit, I'm sorry, I just said a swear on the...
All right. Carol, you're our last caller of the day. We got about 30 seconds for the show. Go ahead, Carol.
Hey, great. It's my birthday. I'm 60, and your birthday's Thursday.
Happy birthday, Carol.
And I saw you on the news talking about the nurses' strike and your dad, and I wish all of you well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, Dad was released after his cancer surgery the day before the nursing strike, the Providence Circuit strike, first big hospital nursing strike in our town in nearly 20 years, maybe just about 20 years, maybe 21 years. Was it 2002? I don't remember the last one. What I want to say is thank you. I'll be with you tomorrow. I'll be with you Wednesday. And the welcome you all give me is so appreciated. It's one of the main reasons I love doing this. And the other is how much we learn. And to Mick, who gave the plug for worker cooperatives, to, it wasn't Carol, or was it Carol, who told us, it was Carol, to be aware of our own, the previous Carol, to be aware of our own limitations. To our listener who reminded us, as we think about our own limitations, let's think also long term. What are we going to make sure that we can do that future generations will be able to not live merely in hubris or punished by our hubris or our selfishness or our greed? What can we do to grow things, to make the world a little bit better rather than a lot worse? Y'all are priceless. Definition of priceless, worth a lot, not for sale. You're the coalition of benevolently irrational, the good people doing good things for no good reason. Appreciate you very much. Be back with you tomorrow. And as Tom might say, tag, you're it.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We say fight back!
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the HartmannReport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.